Take a piss if you need to, and let's talk." He sat up again, the blanket draped over his head like a voyageur's cowl, and blinked at her like an owl in daylight. And then, somehow, he slipped over the edge of the bed and down on one knee on the floor, arms spread gracefully, head bowed, a genuflection worthy of any up-and-comer at court. "Your munificence," he said, "please forgive me. My piss and I are at your command." Liz tried to think of what she should command his piss to do, but then she took a second look. He was so bloody thin, and the outstretched hands were trembling, and when his eyes met hers, the bottomless hunger in them broke her heart. Sasha was not amused. Grabbing the busker's outstretched arms, she twisted them behind his back and shoved him flat on his face on the floor. Planting a knee at the base of his spine, she growled, "Do you think this is some kind of joke? The princess doesn't have time for your nonsense." "Hang on," Liz said. "Let him go, Sasha." Sasha looked up at her, a warning in her eyes. "He's a chameleon, Your Highness. He knows how to play you." "I know that," Liz said, "and you may be right, but still." Reluctantly, Sasha released the busker and sat back on her heels, hands on her thighs, waiting. Pale as eggshells, the boy lay on the cell floor, gasping for breath. Then he rolled over, tried to sit up, then doubled over again. Liz knelt next to him. Sasha put her hand on Liz's arm. "Your Highness, don't get too close to him. If he's really sick, it might be something catching, and if he's not, he might witch you. At least wait until we can have a wizard in here with us." Liz had no gift for healing, no instinct for diagnosis, but she couldn't help thinking the boy's distress wasn't a sham. Not entirely, anyway. "What's the matter with you?" she said. This time the busker came up onto his knees. "I'm sorry, Your Highness, to be in such a state. He retched, then threw up onto the stone floor, spattering Liz's knees. I'm sorry." Taking hold of his shirt tail, he tried to swipe the sick from her trousers. "Leave off," Sasha growled. "Don't touch her, you murderous gutter-swiving." "I'm all right," Liz said. "I've been smeared with worse. Never mind." The busker licked cracked lips. "I'm sorry about the mess. I'm just not at my best in the morning, is all. Perhaps if you came back later." Behind her, Sasha snorted in derision. "You'd think he was coming off a binge, wouldn't you? I guarantee he hasn't been drinking in here." Liz stared at the busker, who lay, sucking in shallow breaths. "How long has he been like this?" "He looked pretty good when he arrived," Sasha said. "It's only been today that he's been complaining that he's sick. Maybe he heard you were coming and knew the jig was up." "Call in a healer," Liz said. "With all due respect." "Do it," Liz said wearily. "He may be faking, but we can't take the chance that it's something serious or something catching. He needs to stay alive." The healer, Grace, looked too young to have much experience, but she'd practiced under Willow Watersong at Marisa Pine's camp, so she must have had some chops. She studied the busker, her eyes narrowed, then checked his pulse, brushed the backs of her fingers across his clammy skin, and peeled back his eyelid to have a look, ignoring his weak protests and a series of vile oaths, followed by the usual litany of apologies. She leaned in toward him and said, "Did you take something, boy?" "No," he said quickly, as if he'd anticipated the question. "No?" She raised an eyebrow. "Well, not for a long time." "What do you call a long time?" The busker didn't respond, only lay there in a heap of misery. "We can't help you if you don't tell the truth," Liz said. "You're not here to help me," the busker said. "Maybe we can help each other," Liz said. The busker rolled onto his back, shading his eyes against the light with his forearm. "All right, I do use the leaf now and then," he said, "but I can take or leave." "How long's it been?" the healer asked. "This morning." "This morning?" Sasha would have said more, but Grace raised her hand to hush her. "So you've used it in here?" He nodded, then twitched as tremors rolled through him. "There's no way you smuggled anything in here," Sasha said, looking personally offended. "Or smoked it if you did. I don't believe you." The boy cracked a smile. "Maybe," he said, "I outsmarted you. Maybe some people aren't as hard-hearted as you are." He gasped and doubled up, clutching at his middle. "Only, this seems to be unusually—" He didn't seem to know how to finish the sentence. Sasha began tearing the cell apart, pawing through the busker's meager belongings. "Where is it?" she demanded. "Where do you hide the rest of it?" "There wasn't much," he said. "It's all gone. I wouldn't— Ah!" His face twisted, squeezing out tears, and he rolled into a ball. "I think you might have smoked some bad leaf," Grace said. "It would help if I could have a look at any that's left." For a long moment, the busker didn't respond. Then he reached into his breeches and pulled out a small pouch. "Here." He swallowed hard. "But I hope you'll see your way clear to give it back when you're done looking." Grace didn't reply. She yanked open the drawstring neck and shook a dark wad out onto her palm. She rubbed it between her fingers and took a sniff. Her eyes widened, and she took another. Then she dumped the leaf back into the bag, crossed to the washstand, and scrubbed her hands thoroughly. "Whoever sold you that leaf was no friend," she said. "It's been soaked in oil of moonflower." "I've never heard of that," the busker gasped. "That's because it's a poison," Grace said. For a long moment, nobody said anything. Sasha, in particular, looked like she'd been run over by a cart. "Well," the busker said with a hollow laugh, "that explains a lot." Liz dropped to her knees beside him. "Busker," she said, "this is important. Where did you get this razor leaf?" He looked up at her with muddled eyes. Then he shrank back, batting at something invisible. "Get away!" Liz leaned back to avoid his flailing arms. Sasha moved in on his other side, doing her best to pin his arms. The busker quieted a bit. His eyes cleared and focused in on Liz. I didn't know. Your Highness, you have to believe me. I didn't know they were going to try and kill you." "I believe you," Liz said, gripping his hand. "Now where did you get the leaf?" "Somebody must have slid it through the bars last night while I was asleep," he said. "I woke up and found it. I thought it was a good Samaritan." He went rigid and began to tremble uncontrollably. "He's having a seizure," Grace said. "Roll him onto his left side, put a pillow behind him, and make sure he can breathe. You," she motioned to Sasha, "keep an eye out. If he vomits, clear it out so it doesn't get into his lungs. His lips are pink, and his nails are too, so he's getting air. Hopefully his lungs aren't too damaged." "Is there any treatment we can give him?" "Just support. If he'd swallowed it, we could dilute it with water or use charcoal or force vomiting, but it's in his bloodstream already." "This is my fault," Sasha said, her face gray. "I should have known I couldn't keep this quiet. I should have been more careful. Now somebody's got to him on my watch." Anger and frustration knifed through Liz. "What are his odds, Grace?" The healer rocked her hand back and forth. "I'd like his chances better if he was healthy. From the looks of things, he's been using a lot of leaf. If you keep on using, you just burn yourself up. A lower body weight makes any poison more potent. Liz looked across at Sasha. Who has access to the cell block? Just the Queen's Guard, Sasha said. Some in the Highlanders, nobody from outside. Liz stood. We need him alive and well enough to interview. Clearly somebody doesn't want that to happen. I don't want him to have any visitors without my approval, and no unvetted guards on him. I'm putting the two of you in charge of his care. I want both of you in here around the clock until he recovers. Me? Sasha said, looking horrified. I thought that with you back here, I'd be assigned to... This is the most important thing you can do right now to keep me safe. If he dies, we'll lose the one connection we have to whoever ordered the attack. Liz could hear the boy's raspy breathing from where she stood. Don't you dare die on me, Busker. If you do, I'll make a special trip to hunt you in hell. 36. By Land and by Sea. It had been 2 weeks since Jenna collected her leatherwork from Sparrow, but she and Cass hadn't traveled far. They had decided that Fortress Rocks was a good location for flying practice. It was remote enough that they could fly for miles without being seen, and the terrain was variable, craggy mountains and high plateaus, and coastline within a few hours as the dragonflies. She hesitated to travel too far from the coast until she and Cass got a few things sorted out between them, like the many differences between people and dragons, their priorities, and their physical limits. Cass was high-spirited, headstrong, and growing at what seemed to be an impossible rate. The clothing and armor Sparrow had made for her fit well, so now she looked like a real warrior, but that didn't really make her one. She was woefully short on the kinds of skills she would need to confront Strangward or the Empress. She didn't exactly know what she would be up against, but she had a feeling that a sharp pair of ears, a keen eye, and a layer of scales wouldn't be enough. As a working-class city girl, she'd never had any reason to learn to use a bow, even for hunting. She'd had no practice with a sword. The closest she'd come was when she'd killed Mark with her mother's jeweled dagger. She was good at setting fire to things and blowing things up on the ground. She guessed she could drop boulders or bombs on an enemy. Still, she felt like the weak link. Cass had armor and weapons built in. He seemed to look on Jenna as a small, rather feeble dragon who'd somehow misplaced her wings, yet showed no sign of growing a new pair. They practiced incinerating dead trees and sharpening Cass's aim, even when flying at high speed, and flying the zigzag patterns that would allow them to evade enemy fire. Sometimes they played games in the sky, writing words with smoke and flame, because that took precision flying. Sometimes they engaged in mock aerial battles with eagles and hawks. The tack Sparrow had made worked spectacularly well, especially considering that the leatherworker had never seen a dragon. Jenna had to make some adjustments to get it to the right size, and then continually refit it to accommodate Cass's growth. She'd always been good with her hands. Flamecaster scarcely seemed to notice the harness and saddle once Jenna strapped it on, but it gave Jenna a lot more confidence when the young dragon got creative with acrobatics. Now she clung to his back like a briar in wool, no matter how many twists and turns he made. For now, the best strategy seemed to be avoiding people altogether. The sudden appearance of a dragon in any populated area would end badly for Cass, or the people, or both. Once they landed, Jenna wouldn't be much help unless her opponent agreed to hold still long enough to be blown up. She resolved to change that. I can't hide out forever, Jenna thought. Sooner or later I'm going to have to go hunting for bigger game. She didn't know much about foraging either. Flamecaster brought fresh meat on a regular basis, and Jenna was able to rig up a fishing line and catch a few fish, and she found some mussels in the streams, plus watercress and cattail shoots and frozen cranberries in the marshes. Most everything else was buried in snow, or if it wasn't, she was afraid to eat it. Cass made no secret of his disdain for the vegetables she found. Not food. Food for food. Though he did have a bit of a sweet tooth. But Jenna could gather berries all day, and it wouldn't even be a mouthful for the dragon. She wanted to get familiar with the harbors and inlets along the coast, places where a pirate might be found. She'd also promised Cass they would go fishing. So one morning they headed for the coast. They left before the sun was even aglow on the horizon, hoping that by the time it was light, they would be far to the north, where, Jenna hoped, it would be less populated, and they would be less likely to be seen. They soared over snow-covered peaks, then turned straight north toward an inlet called Invaders Bay on the map. The mountains formed a dark wall to their left, and the distant Indio was somewhere out there in the dark to their right. The peninsula they were crossing was relatively flat and snow-covered. Midway across, Jenna could see a large, dark shadow below, moving south toward them. "What's that?" Jenna muttered. "Herd of fells deer," Flamecaster said hopefully. "Fat sheep?" "Not at night," Jenna muttered. "Let's go see." As they drew closer, Jenna could see that it was a swarm of riders pushing hard to cross that flat span of land. Now and then they glittered as the setting moon reflected off the weapons they carried. An army. As they flew over the horse troops, Cass stayed high, which was his usual practice when they encountered the rare person on their flights. Hopefully, in a land unfamiliar with dragons, they'd be taken for some sort of large bird. Was this the Northern Highlander army on the move, riding hard to meet some sort of threat from the south? If so, they weren't wearing their usual camouflage clothing, the greens and browns of the forest, or the white of the winter landscape. Could Arden be moving to retake Delphi, or attack Fortress Rocks again? They weren't wearing the dirtbag tan of Arden either. In fact, their clothing varied dramatically, so much so that they didn't look like an army at all. But they moved like an army under orders for a forced march. Could they be a band of mercenaries hired by Arden? Were these more of Strangwort's lot? What was it King Gerard had called them? Horse savages? Had they come here from Carthage to close the jaws of a trap around her from a different direction? "It's not always about you," she told herself, but she needed to know. "Cass, can you go a little lower?" By now, the moon had been swallowed by the clouds shrouding the western peaks, so at least they wouldn't cast a shadow on the ground. Jenna had to hope that her eyes were sharper than those of the horse warriors. Flamecaster came around and crossed the peninsula again, dropping much lower than he usually did so she could take a closer look. Though the riders were bundled up warmly, there was something about their dress and appearance that reminded Jenna of Strangwort's guard, the Stormborn, he'd called them. Then her breath seemed to catch in her throat. They were mages, most of them, mages who displayed an odd tinted glow, like the one she associated with Strangwort's companions. Strangwort's mages had glowed red. The wizards she'd seen in Delphi, the only kind she'd seen until recently, glowed with a blue-white light. These glowed purple, like a shadow or a deep bruise, almost as if they were sucking up light rather than giving it off. Why would they send so many to hunt one girl? They didn't know about Cass, did they? Or were they on some other mission? Should she warn someone? Who? If they were looking for her, the last thing she needed was to draw attention to herself. Riding in on a dragon would be a good way to do that. She didn't know enough even to take sides. Anyway, maybe mages in the north came in all sorts of colors. This northern country that had seemed so empty was getting too crowded. "Let's get out of here," Jenna said, nudging the dragon with her knees. "Let's try our luck farther south this time." Cass turned, making a wide, shallow arc to head back toward the shelter of the mountains. They approached the coast again, this time aiming between the town of Chalk Cliffs and the border port of Spirit Gate. As they neared the ocean, the terrain plateaued until it ended in a series of white cliffs along the water. Those were easy to pick out, even in the gray dawn, for sharp-eyed flyers. A harbor town hugged the tops of the cliffs. This would be chalk cliffs. "Fish?" Flamecaster prompted her, in case she'd forgotten. "Remember, first we're going to fly along the coast and look for ships. Then we'll fish." Fishing was the carrot that had enticed Cass to agree to this plan. After his experience with Strangwort, he was still wary of ships. The dragon ascended rapidly as they passed over the harbor, and the few ships anchored there. Higher and higher they flew, and Jenna knew that the dragon meant to come down in one of his steep dives that left her stomach far behind. But as they reached the top of the climb, she looked out to sea, far out to sea, and saw 3 tall ships anchored a few miles offshore, silhouetted against the brightening eastern horizon. What are they doing out there? Jenna thought. Flamecaster saw them just about the same time and put on the brakes so abruptly that if not for her improved seat in the saddle, Jenna would have been pitched over the dragon's head. "Dark place. Chains. Collar hurts." Making a tight turn, the dragon made a beeline for shore, his neck stretched forward as if that would get him there sooner. "Hang on, wait. It's all right, Cass. I won't let that happen to you again." It made no difference. The dragon didn't slow down until they were back over land again. She could feel his heart thumping in his throat, and every now and then he whimpered. Jenna thought about it. She'd never gotten a good look at Strangwort's ship, except when they'd soared over it just before it exploded. Her vision was good, but the dragon's eyes were even better. "Do those ships look like the one you came here in, Cass?" "Maybe." His hide quivered under her fingers. "No fish today." Had Strangwort returned so soon, with 3 ships this time, to try his luck again? Had the Empress joined the hunt? How would they know if she was here in the north? They could be Ardenine vessels, ready to swoop in on ships entering or leaving the harbor, or pirates after other goods that had nothing to do with her. "Mountains." Cass had been subtly shifting course, flying more and more westerly, away from the coast. She understood his desire to flee back into the mountains, but if they were going to go after Strangwort or the Empress, Cass would have to make his peace with ships. They both had demons to fight. Maybe, with a little shared courage, they could do it. "Not every ship is after us," she said, resting her cheek on Flamecaster's shoulder and stroking him between his stubby horns. "Let's find some fish." She'd been working on teaching the dragon directions, and now he swerved south, following the coast just offshore. They'd gone just a short distance when another tremor ran through him. "More ships." Cass was trying to sound nonchalant. "Not after us, maybe." Jenna looked down and saw what seemed to be a race going on. 2 northbound ships were running parallel to the cliffs, zigzagging back and forth to catch the wind. The ship in the lead was a smaller vessel, broad of beam with 2 masts. It wallowed a bit through the waves, slow to turn and maneuver. The other was a sleek, tall ship with multiple sails. This one closely resembled the ship she and Adam Wolf had destroyed at Arden's court, and the ships they'd just seen lurking offshore. Jenna didn't know much about ships, but even she could tell that this was the faster of the 2. It seemed like it was only a matter of time before the one overtook the other. Was the smaller ship a Felsian vessel under attack by Arden or the Empress? If so, should they help? "This is not your fight," she told herself. "If it's not, then how do you know when it is your fight?" A memory came back to her, of her father pleading with her to quit blowing up things. "I wish you wouldn't do the things that you do. That's surely a job for someone else. Nobody takes the risks that you take." And her response, "I'm not going to huddle in a garret while others do my fighting for me." If that's Strangwort's ship, or Strangwort's allies, then it's my fight. Jenna sighed. "Cass, can you go down a little closer so I can make out the colors?" Making a shallow turn over the land, Cass came around again, swooping lower over the 2 ships. The smaller ship flew a banner with a yellow star on a blue field. Was that the Felsian flag? She had no idea. The larger ship flew a black flag, which seemed to name it the villain. As if to underline that thought, the larger ship launched a ball of fire at the ship in the lead. It landed a short distance off their bow. It was not cannon fire. It was some kind of majory. "Pirates miss." Cass curled his lip in scorn, exposing sword-sharp teeth. "No good." "I think they're missing on purpose," Jenna said. "They don't want to sink them. They want them to surrender." Now the larger ship ran another flag up its mast. It was a purple death's head on a black background. The same colors Strangward's ship had flown. Pirate colors. Did that mean it was Strangward? How could he have found another ship so quickly? Was it the Empress herself? Suddenly, Cass pitched and rolled sideways, flapping madly to regain his equilibrium and avoid smashing into the cliff. By the time he righted himself, they were some distance inland. For a moment, Jenna thought that she might lose her breakfast. "Jenna sick?" Cass sounded worried. She couldn't blame him. She'd thrown up on him before. "It was just, I guess I wasn't expecting that," Jenna said. "What happened?" "Wind changed." That stirred something in Jenna's memory, but she couldn't pin it down. By the time they made it back to the coastline, the smaller ship was lying just offshore, the bigger ship blocking the way out to sea. They could see people moving on the decks, and she could hear shouting between the two ships. The pirates seemed to be demanding that the smaller ship surrender, and the crew of the smaller ship seemed to be refusing. Now the small ship raised a different flag, a stylized dragon, not Felsian then, and returned fire, destroying the pirate ship's tallest mast. The dragon-flagged ship plowed north again, hugging the shoreline. After some momentary confusion, the pirates gave chase, lobbing bolts of flame at their quarry that came close, but never hit. Cass followed, skimming the cliff top, so hopefully they wouldn't be seen. Should they intervene? Set fire to the pirate ship? Drop a block of granite onto its deck and put a hole in it? It would be easier to pick sides if they knew for sure who was down there. Since they didn't, it was hard to justify risking themselves. Does he really think he can outrun them? Jenna thought. Not running, Flamecaster said. No feet. Jenna rolled her eyes. Dragon jokes. As it turned out, the little ship didn't need their help. Just as the bigger ship seemed close to overtaking them again, it appeared to slam into an unseen barrier. With an awful crunching, grinding sound, the bow of the pirate ship lifted a little, then settled back as the ship shuddered to a stop, listing. The smaller ship sailed on. Jenna could hear faint cheering from the decks. Now she could see the shadowy shapes under the water, extending out from the shoreline. A reef. It took a moment for her to figure it out. The smaller, shore-hugging boat had a shallower draft than the sleek pirate. She could glide over an obstacle that stopped the blue-water ship in its tracks. In other words, the crew of the little ship had outsmarted the pirates. The pirates had figured that out too, because now a storm of flame arced from the larger ship, hissing into the water all around the other ship, which was rapidly putting distance between them. One blast of flame finally hit home, cracking one of the masts in two, but the little ship kept moving, the crew manipulating two smaller sails until it was out of range. Jenna was torn between following after the smaller ship and taking a closer look at the pirates, who were swarming over the decks, trying to put out the flames in the mast and rigging. She could see someone standing on a small raised deck behind the tallest mast, shouting orders to the others. Someone who glowed so brightly that Jenna had to squint. "Can you get down a little closer?" I'm sure those are someone's last words, she thought. Jenna could sense the dragon's bone-deep terror. Not after us, not after us. He slowly spiraled down toward the water's surface, his muscles bunched with tension. Maybe it was catching, because as they drew closer, a dull dread took root in her and grew. The mage mark on her neck seethed and burned as if it might burst into flame. Every fiber of her being screamed danger. "Jenna!" Cass gave her a mental nudge. "One quick look, then we'll go," she said. The first surprise was that the figure on the deck was a young woman, not much older than Jenna. Locks of metallic silver hair twisted around her head like a nest of snakes in a scary story. She wore a leather waistcoat over a snowy linen shirt with a divided skirt. The dagger belted at her side. Jenna's heart quivered and almost stopped. It was a jeweled, curved dagger, like the one left to her by her mother, the one her father had kept hidden in a box under her bed until they came for her. This must be the Empress that she'd been warned about, that had been hunting her, that she was hunting now. Celestine. Surely she was too young to be an Empress. It was as if the Empress heard her name. She stiffened, then looked up and saw them. A rush of emotion all but foundered them. "You!" Jenna wasn't sure whether the Empress spoke aloud or inside her head, but the message was clear. Mingled triumph, joy, and unbridled lust. The Empress extended her arms, greedily reaching for them. "Cass!" The dragon was already climbing, his neck extended, his muscles bunching and releasing as he sliced through the air. Jenna clung to his back, shaking, and no use to anyone. When they were high in the sky, Jenna took one quick look back. The Empress still stood on her ship's deck, hands on hips, watching them go, ignoring her crew, who were still frantically fighting the fire. When they were out of sight of the pirate ship, Cass slowed his frantic wing beats and flattened his climb a bit. "What now?" It was a measure of his agitation that fishing wasn't even mentioned. "We need to find that smaller ship the pirates were attacking," Jenna said. "It seems like they might have some of the answers we want." 37. A second interview. Brian didn't remember much about the days immediately after he smoked the bad leaf. Most of it he didn't want to remember, being the kind of person who tries to move on from misery. He didn't know how much of it was from the poisoned leaf, and how much from withdrawal, but it wasn't something he cared to relive in his mind, or elsewhere. But there were a couple of high points. For instance, Talbot scrubbing the muck off him with this wonderful rough, hot washcloth which left his skin tingling, and feeding him thick soups and rich puddings once he stopped hurling. She might have even massaged his back when it was tied up in knots, but he might have made that up. There was this other thing that was probably a dream, but he enjoyed it anyway. He heard this wonderful music and thought it might be choirs of angels, which didn't make sense, given the way he'd lived his life up to now. It turned out to be the princess playing her basilka for him. Now I can die happy, he thought. He'd thought he was on his way to doing that before he got executed. They likely had special methods for those who try to hush a princess, and he'd just as soon sit that out. But now he was actually feeling better, so he had to act fast. Dying seemed easier than escaping. Brian closed his eyes and folded his hands and tried to let go of his body. But he kept on breathing, and before long he got hungry and thirsty and had to take a piss. Why is it that a person is always dying when he doesn't plan on it, but when it's in his best interest he has no luck at all? The next time Talbot came in, Brian asked for pen and paper, and she brought some. "I hope you're planning to write out your confession, scumbag," she said. But he could tell that her heart wasn't in it. Brian was pretty sure he was winning Talbot over. As time went on, she seemed less and less likely to cut off body parts. That had been his goal, to remain intact during his incarceration. A man has to have goals, and now that he was off the leaf, he was doing better at remembering them. Besides, Brian wasn't used to being hated. He didn't like being packed in with somebody who looked like they wanted to yank his guts out through his eyes, or some other aperture. Another good word, aperture. He wondered where he'd picked that up. Words were like the Tamric itch. All of a sudden you had it, and don't know where you got it. "Well," Talbot said, "what are you planning to write?" Brion hadn't realized that she actually wanted an answer. "I'm going to write my eulogy," he said. "What's that?" Talbot said suspiciously. "It's kind of a tribute speech they give after a person is dead," Brion said. "Why do you need one of those?" Talbot took a quick look around. "You aren't planning to. You're the one that said I'd be hung for the 2 that died in Ragmarket." "Oh, right. You will be." Only this time she wasn't gloating like before. "You're going to write your own? Nobody else is going to do it." "You've got that right," she said with a snort. But still, she stood, rubbing the back of her neck, frowning at him. "You don't have anyone. There's nobody we should send a message to." "No," he said. Aubrey had cared about him, he was sure of it, but he wasn't going to send them out hunting for her. He imagined himself going to the block, and her out in the audience somewhere, in a long black veil. He liked everything about that story, except the going to the block part. Then he had an inspiration. He looked up at Talbot and said, "If I write something down, would you read it?" "Me?" Talbot took 2 steps back. "You don't want me reading it." She paused. "Do you?" "I do," Brion said. "I feel like you've been a big part of the story of the end of my life. I've probably spent more time with you than anybody else that could do it." "What are you going to write?" Talbot asked suspiciously. "You'll see. If you look it over and you don't want to read it, you don't have to. I'll be dead anyway." "All right," she said. "Fair enough." She cleared her throat. "My name is Sasha. Call me Brion, if you want." It wasn't easy to come up with anything to write. Half of his life had been blotted from his memory, and he didn't really want to write the other half down. Now that his mind was clear, he was remembering things he'd done that he'd just as soon leave buried. It was like when you find something promising lying in the street, and you rinse it off, and it's just a hunk of broken glass. "It's all in the presentation," he thought, looking over his page of scratched-out lines. "He tried to look out for his friends. He knew how to have a good time. He told stories. He loved sunrises and puppies and walks by the ocean. Sometimes he made people forget their worries for a little while." Then again, you could say pretty much the same for Leaf. Speaking of Leaf, he wondered if he would be granted any last requests. When he wasn't struggling to put words together, he spent his time reading and sleeping and eating. It wasn't a bad way to spend his final days. He was just grateful that he wasn't spending them sweating and shaking and cramping and heaving. He was mortified at the display he'd put on when the princess came to see him. He would offer a sincere apology if he ever saw her again, which he probably wouldn't, which was probably just as well. A few days later, Brion was sitting under the window where the light was best, struggling with his eulogy. Sasha had called him a charm caster, but that didn't seem to project the right image. He decided he should go with something more dramatic, like Shadowcaster. "They called him Shadowcaster because he came out of the shadows and stole the minds and hearts of men, also women. They called him Shadowcaster because he cast a great shadow over the events of the day. People called him a murderer, but it just wasn't true. They called him Shadowcaster because his music was like a torrent of light amid the shadows." No, actually, it was the other way around. That was the problem. He was trying to write a story about a hero, but the truth kept elbowing in and ruining it. "This story isn't about you. This is about the person you wish you were."
Just then, the door banged open, and in came Her Highness with Sasha Talbot, a moblet of bluejackets, and, to his surprise, Rogan Shadow Dancer, Shadow in the north.
The traitor must be back from wherever he'd gone off to. To Brion's relief, the young mage Finn wasn't with them this time. Brion brushed his fingers over his nearly healed arm. He still wasn't exactly sure what had happened, but he wanted to avoid a repeat. The princess arrived with an entourage. Entourage? That was a good word. Shadowcaster always travelled with an entourage. His friends were many, and his enemies few. Maybe in his next life. Brion wrote the line down before he put his scribbling aside. He rose and crossed the room to where they stood. The bluejackets leapt to get between him and the princess. He made what he hoped was a graceful bow. "Your Highness," he said, "I apologize for my appearance and my behavior the last time we met." "Are you talking about the time you lured me into an ambush, or the time you threw up on me?" The princess said. "I apologize for both," Brion said, bowing still lower. When he straightened, she was studying him, her head cocked, eyes narrowed. So he studied her back. The night of the concert, he'd seen her first on the stage in her fancy dress, and later on the street in her tribal garb. Now she was dressed like a soldier in the spattery colors the Northerners wore. It was like she was 3 different girlies in one. He'd sensed some of that in her song. "You're not the only one that's a chameleon," he thought. "Only, in my case, it's more like I don't really know who I am." "You're looking amazingly well," the princess said. "It's hard to believe you're the same person." Brion fussed with the cuffs of his prison shirt. He'd rolled them a bit and turned up his collar for a casual, jaunty look. "I am not the same person, Your Highness," he said. "I am transformed, thanks to Corporal Talbot here, and Grace, and your team of healers. I would be happy to answer any questions you have. I can't tell you how relieved I was to find out that you survived the attack the night of the concert." "Especially since you were caught," Sasha said. The princess looked him up and down, head to toe. "Are you getting enough to eat?" "Yes," Brion said, embarrassed. He knew he looked like a street urchin in a famine. He patted his stomach, or where it should have been if he'd had one. "The food's good, and there's plenty. I've probably already gained a few pounds." "You could use a few more," the princess said bluntly. She motioned for the guards to bring up some chairs, 3 chairs facing one. "Sit down," she said. Brion took the single chair, and the princess sat opposite with Sasha to her left, Shadow to her right. That was when Brion noticed that Shadow was carrying his Jafasa. Not only that, it had been repaired. It looked to be as good as new. Shadow set the Jafasa on the floor, the neck resting against his thigh, and curled one arm protectively around it. Brion stared at it. It was like it crowded everything else out of his mind. It was the first time in a long time that he'd felt a bone-deep ache for anything other than Leaf. "What do you like to be called, Busker?" the princess asked. "Brion," he said. He licked his lips and took a chance. "I can't help but notice that you've repaired my Jafasa." Shadow nodded. "I believe I have restored your musical instrument to playing condition." "Shall I try it and see?" Brion said, reaching for it. Shadow pulled the Jafasa back, out of reach. "You'll have to take my word for it for now," he said. For now? Did that mean that eventually? "I didn't realize that you were a luthier," Brion said. "I make flashcraft," Shadow said. Brion shifted his hungry gaze from the Jafasa to the trader. "Flashcraft? What do you mean?" "We are assuming that there is magic in this device, that it functions like an amulet to channel power," the princess said. "So we decided to repair it and see if it would help us understand your magic." Has it? The trader shrugged. We're all eager to hear what you have to say. It had been a long time since Brion had thought of much, aside from making it to his next hit. He'd not thought of his talent for connection as majory. That would be a dangerous play in Arden or any of the down realms. I don't know. I'm just a musician. I don't know how it works. I mean, I know how to play it is all. He paused. I can play the flute, too, and the basilka, and the harpsichord in a pinch. Do they all charm people, the way the Jafasa does? Shadow stroked the fretboard gently, like he was taunting him. Musical instruments are simply tools that allow nuanced musical expression in the hands of the right person, Brion said. They all gaped at him. He was a little surprised himself. He sure was discovering a big stash of words, now that he'd quit the leaf. The mage mark on your neck says that you're more than a simple musician. I said I was a musician. I didn't say I was simple. He thought a moment. Like I said, any instrument helps, even my voice. It's just that the Jafasa or the basilka, really any stringed instrument, can deliver a complexity that my voice can't. People are chords, not single notes. So unless somebody is a very simple person, my voice doesn't capture them exactly. Her Highness nodded. When I heard you playing, it was like I knew the song before I ever heard it. I've never, been on the receiving end, so all I can tell you is what it's like from my end. He thought a moment. I connect to people, he said. I read them, and I hear their music and play it back to them. Everyone is different. Everyone has a different song. I don't understand, Shadow said. You see, that's what's so seductive, Brion said. Everybody flinched at the word seductive, but he soldiered on. We come into this world alone, and we go out of it the same way. Even our partner, our lover, our best friend, they can only know a part of us, and that knowledge is imperfect. Imagine hearing your song, your truth, reflected back to you. It resonates here. He pressed his fist against his chest. I don't have to imagine it, the princess whispered, putting her hand over her own heart. Are you saying that you're a mind reader? Sasha looked a little panicky, like she wanted to race from the room, like she had thoughts she didn't want to share. Brion shook his head. It's more like a current that runs between me and the listener. It's like, all your life you've been looking for someone who understands, and now you do. It seemed like it shuts out everything else too, the princess said. It was like everything else was thrown into shadow. Exactly, Brion thought, pleased. Shadowcaster. The question is, Busker, are you casting light or casting shadow? Shadow said. That was a very good question. Brion wished that he had a very good answer. He just shrugged. Who hired you to lay in wait for the princess heir and lure her away from her friends? Sasha said, as if eager to get onto a more solid footing. I didn't do the deal myself, Brion said. It was my manager. Your manager? The princess sat forward. Who is that? He went by Wax, but I think his real name was Crosby or Crowley, maybe. Wax, Talbot butted in. Right, you know. From the blank looks on their faces, they didn't know. Like shares, everybody gets a whack of the pie, but Wax always got the biggest slice. Where can we find him? Shadow said. He's dead. He was murdered in a warehouse back in Fellsmarch, along with one of my, colleagues. Princess Alyssa's eyes narrowed, and Brion got the idea that she already knew about the bodies in Southbridge. I think it went down during the street concert, Brion said. If I'd have been there, I'd be dead too. He scanned their faces, looking for sympathy, but got none. And you were the only one that escaped? Shadow wasn't buying.
Well, me and Aubrey, Brienne said. You know, the girlie that travelled with us.
So Aubrey was in on it? Shadow leaned forward, as if eager to suck down this new knowledge.
What do you mean, in on it?
Brienne was getting a little prickly himself.
She knew about the gig, that's all. We're musicians. There were 4 of us that travelled together, including Wax.
Where is Aubrey now? Shadow asked. Maybe he and Aubrey had been at odds lately, but Brienne wasn't going to give her up.
Like I said, I don't know. All I can figure is she saw through you before I did and ran.
He paused. Something had just occurred to him.
Hang on. She wasn't the one who outed me, was she?
No, Shadow said. I figured it out on my own. So this Wax was the one who gave you the orders? You're claiming you never met the client? They all 3 leaned forward.
Actually, I did meet the client on the street before the concert.
Brienne explained about the meeting with the supposed star-crossed suitor, the instructions he'd been given.
He was the one that gave me the locket and the flowers.
He gave you the flowers? Shadow looked at Talbot as if that was a major clue.
Aye, he did. I thought it was peculiar at the time that he didn't want to give them to her himself. I mean, wouldn't you want to get the credit?
Sasha pulled out the princess's locket, pried it open, and studied the images inside.
Why would this client give you her locket? There's no picture of her in here. Why would she carry a picture of herself when she could always look in the mirror?
Brienne said, then cursed himself for a smart-ass.
What Talbot means is, why was the locket important?
Shadow said.
It sometimes helps me to connect if I have something that belongs to them,
Brienne said.
It helps me get to know them better.
I knew it, Talbot said, slapping her thigh, as if he'd just signed a full confession.
Maybe you're not a regular wizard, but you're some kind of charm caster just the same.
The way she said charm caster, it sounded filthy.
I'm a musician, Brienne said stubbornly. It was supposed to be a street concert. I had no idea what was going down. You didn't think that was an odd request?
Brienne hesitated, then decided to continue on with the truth, since it hadn't cost him so far.
I did think it was an odd request, but no odder than some others I've heard. As soon as some hear private performance, they get all kinds of ideas. But I'm a musician, that's all, not a killer.
Although the client had asked him to lead the girlie along the riverbank to a secluded place where he'd be waiting, and Brienne had questioned it at the time, but went ahead anyway.
Anybody with a brain in his head would have known something bad was going down,
this annoying voice in his head said.
What was the money?
Shadow asked. When Brienne didn't answer right away, Sasha said, What did you get paid to deliver a girl into the hands of assassins?
What did I get paid? Nothing. Well, I did get a suit of clothes and a bath, but lives go cheap these days, don't they? No, Brienne said. According to Wax, the client was offering 40 girlies. I was supposed to be paid after the wooing. The wooing? Is that what you call it?
The princess glared at him. Brienne's cheeks burned.
Since the client told me he was a suitor, I used music to put
he didn't want to use target, since he was in enough trouble already.
The audience into a willing mood. Willing to do what?
Sasha had the kind of look on her face that said she might just come through the table at him. Brienne groped desperately for something to say that wouldn't be too incriminating.
Willing to, listen to what my client had to say. That's all.
Talbot shook her head, her face twisted in disgust. Brienne sighed inwardly. I'm losing ground again, he thought. She'll be back to hating me before long. What did he look like? Princess Alyssa said. I didn't get a good look at him. He was all wrapped up in a cloak, with a scarf muffling his face. Brienne paused. He was tall, taller than me, and I'm not sure, but I think he was a mage. Shadow sat forward. What makes you think so? He had a magish glow. Now we're getting somewhere, Sasha said with mock enthusiasm. We'll just question all the tall wizards in the queendom and see if we can turn up any leads. That helps, though, the princess said. Anything that narrows the search. Was there anything else, even something minor? Well, he clanked. He clanked? The princess raised an eyebrow. Yeah, it was like something jangled when he moved. He clanked and he jangled and he glowed, Sasha said. We'll nail him for sure. Did the client give you a name? Shadow asked, not looking especially hopeful. Did he? Brienne tried to remember. I don't think so, he said slowly. And then it came to him, like sunlight breaking through cloud. It was Darien, he said. He said his name was Darien. His rushers called him that too. His rushers? Her Highness cocked her head. You heard them talking. How exactly did that happen? It seemed like every question Brienne answered only birthed another question. Yet he was finding that if he told the truth, he didn't have to remember what lies he'd told before. A couple of days after the concert, I went back to the warehouse where I'd been staying. When I got there... His voice faltered. When I got there, Wax and Goose were dead. They'd been murdered. How were they killed? Sasha asked. Again, Brienne had the feeling that she knew the answer and was testing him. Their throats were cut. While I was there, I heard somebody coming, and it turned out it was Darien's rushers, come back to make sure there was no clues left. I heard them talking then. And once again, you escaped, Shadow said, raising an eyebrow. Brienne looked him in the eye. I escaped. What else did they say about this Darien? From what they said, he sent them back there to make sure there were no clues left behind, Brienne said. They seemed scared of him. They all looked at each other. Was there any mention of Arden or the war, or why they would target me? Princess Alyssa asked. Brienne thought about it, then shook his head. They all seemed afraid to ask questions. I'm told you got this musical instrument from your father, Her Highness said. Was he a musician too? Was he the one who taught you how to play? Maybe. I think so. I'm not sure. When Sasha huffed at him, he said, Look, you always think I'm lying, but I'm telling the truth here. I don't remember anything from before I was about 10 years old. I remember wandering the streets of Boston Bay, dragging the Defossa behind. So I started busking, even back then. It was one way for a 10-year-old to make a little coin. Still, I'd probably be dead if Wax hadn't taken me in and added me to his travelling show. Brienne looked from face to face. He'd done his best, but they still looked disappointed. I must admit, Brienne, that I am running out of patience, Her Highness said. You are the single thread that might allow us to track down those responsible for a series of cowardly murders. I need more from you. I've told the truth, Your Highness, Brienne said. It's so bloody rare that I suppose I shouldn't expect everyone to recognize it when they hear it. The princess leaned forward, hands on her knees. I need a lead. I need to find out who is feeding information to those who mean to do us harm. I need something we can use. She gestured toward the others in the room. Everyone here has suffered losses, grievous losses. What am I supposed to tell them? For once, Brienne had nothing to say. Many in my position would feel justified in resorting to torture, Princess Alyssa said with harrowing frankness. Gods and martyrs, Brienne thought. Why couldn't I be the prisoner of a sweet fairy-tale princess instead of this fierce, warlike one? If you torture me, Brienne said, I will talk. I will sing like any bird. I will tell you the most marvelous, detailed stories. I will name names at the highest levels. In fact, one of my accomplices may be right here in this room. He paused, letting that sink in. And it will all be a lie, because I already told you the truth, and that wasn't good enough. His eyes met the princess's. He was all in, knowing that his play could either 1, prompt them to pull out the torture tools right away, or 2, convince them that torture was a waste of time. Naturally, he was hoping for 2. Princess Alyssa sighed. It's only my belief that torture doesn't produce actionable information that stays my hand in this case, she said. Brienne's breath whooshed out, leaving him a little weak and giddy. If I may say so, Your Highness, you are truly an example for others when it comes to— However, she said, setting his heart to hammering again, we have other ways to exert pressure. She picked up the Jafasa with one hand and strode to the hearth, dangling the instrument over the flames. I'll give you a week to think about it. After that, this goes into the fire. She handed it back to Shadow. Think on that, Busker. Maybe you would like a chance to play this one last time before we carry out your sentence. You are truly an example for others when it comes to hard-heartedness. That's what I meant to say. He was already writing a tragic ending to this story. As she turned away, Brienne said, What is the custom here in the north? Am I to be hung, beheaded, or burnt alive? She turned back and smiled a crooked smile. Maybe all 3.
38. Reunion. Jenna found that she preferred the role of hunter to that of prey for a change. Still, even from the air, the fugitive ship wasn't easy to find. The sun was setting again when they finally found it hidden in one of the inlets that sliced the shoreline. The ship was nudged up next to the high cliff and camouflaged with branches and leaves. If not for their 2 pairs of dragon-sharp eyes and a fairly small footprint of land to search, they might not have found it. The crew of this ship, whoever they were, seemed to be skilled at lurking along the shore unseen. Was it because of previous encounters with the Empress, or did they too have something to hide? The fact that they hadn't fled back into a major port raised some important questions, such as, if they were not Northerners, then who were they? Had Jenna and Cass come upon pirates attacking each other? They landed on top of the cliff that hemmed in the inlet and crept forward until they could peek over the edge. Down below they could see a small, hot fire sheltered under the cliff overhang. The enticing smell of roasting meat wafted up to them. But the closer they got to the ship and its crew, the edgier Cass became. Saw ship, now go. When Jenna didn't respond, he nudged her, practically knocking her over. Go! I need to talk to them, Jenna said stubbornly. You stay here. I'm going down there. If there is such a thing as a dragon pitching a fit, Cass came close, complete with a flaming display. He rose up on his hind legs, and Jenna was startled at how big he had become. No, bad ship, bad men. Enough. Go find sheep. Shh, they'll see you. Color, dark, chains. I know you don't like ships, but color, dark, chains. I have to go. The dragon's armor glittered as tremors ran through him. Cass, come with Jenna. She knew he was scared, and it touched her that he wanted to come with her anyway. If you come down with me, you'll scare them. Yes. I want to talk with them, not fight with them. Anyway, you can't maneuver down there. It's too narrow, and you're too big. I don't want you to get hurt. Cass folded his wings tightly against his body and curled his tail around his feet. Small now. In the end, Jenna descended the steep, treacherous trail alone, following the rocky bed of a small stream. All the way down, the dragon's disapproval clamored in her head. He'd promised to stay on top, but dragon promises are as lasting as a late spring snowfall. She inventoried her weapons. She had her bow, but she wasn't yet an accurate shot. She had her knives, she had her wits. That would have to do. When she reached the bottom, she followed the narrow, rocky beach toward the sound of voices and the flickering light of the campfire. The crew spoke an unfamiliar language, but they were laughing and boisterous, so Jenna got the idea that they were celebrating their narrow escape. Easing forward on hands and knees, Jenna peered around a shoulder of rock. Night had effectively fallen down in the ravine. 7 men and women sat cross-legged around the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. It seemed they had just finished their meal. Jenna would have thought they'd be passing around a bottle, but instead they were gathered around a small iron stand where they seemed to be brewing tea. Pirates having a tea party? Not possible. Then a man on the near side of the fire stood, his back to Jenna, his fair hair glittering in the light from the fire. He stripped back his sleeve, exposing his muscular forearm. Drawing a blade, he ran its tip along his arm, leaving a dark line of blood in its wake. While the others watched raptly, he held his arm over the pot simmering over the fire and allowed his blood to drip into it. He followed with a fistful of leaves. After the brew had steeped for a few minutes, he poured it into small cups and passed them around. Each person murmured something and drank. Was this some kind of pirate religion? A bizarre blood rite? Was the fair-haired man a priest or a sacrifice? Jenna's vision rippled as she sought to find the truth in him. Something about his stance, the lithe way he moved, even his clothing was familiar. Then it came to her, like a punch in the gut. It was Strangward. Strangward and his gang, still clinging like a tick to the coast of the Indio. Why then had the Empress fired on him? He was her emissary, right? Maybe Jenna should have recognized him sooner, but it had never occurred to her that Celestine would be firing on her own man. Then again, he had failed in his mission to collect Jenna. Was he paying a blood price for that? With every fiber of her being, Jenna hoped so. This man and his mistress had destroyed her life. She'd never expected to find her quarry so easily, and she didn't like these odds. She needed more firepower. Rising into a crouch, Jenna took one step back, then another. That's when the scent of danger filled her nose. Hearing a slight sound behind her, she grabbed for her knife, began to turn. Someone seized hold of her, 2 massive arms lifting her so that her feet left the ground. She struggled, but her arms were pinned so tightly that they were going numb. Her captor carried her forward into the firelight. The others scrambled to their feet, drawing a variety of weapons. Everyone but Strangward. Balancing lightly on his feet, fingering his amulet with one hand, head cocked, he studied Jenna and her captor. The light of recognition kindled in his eyes, and his eyebrows rose in surprise. "Hello, Jenna," he said in common, as if he'd run into her in the market. "This is an unexpected pleasure." His crew shifted and murmured, but still did not stow their weapons. Jenna sorted through several possible replies. In the end, she said nothing, letting her scowl do the talking. Strangward looked over her shoulder. "Put her down, Tessa," he said. "Also please disarm her, so that we can have a civil conversation." The pressure on her arms eased, leaving her hands tingling as the blood returned. Tessa carefully set her down on her feet, took the knife from her hand, and patted her down for other weapons. Her skin grew oddly numb, and she knew her scales were surfacing, as they always did in times of danger. When he was nearly finished, Tessa stopped and stared at her, the puzzlement on his face almost comical. Then he reached out a dirty finger and ran it over her cheek. "Lord Strangford," he said, standing to one side and pointing. He added something in their own language. Strangford studied her, then brushed his fingers lightly over her face and the skin on her forearm. He didn't seem nearly as surprised as Tessa. "Dazzling," he murmured. He took a step back and looked her up and down, taking in her riding skirt and sheepskin jacket. "It seems that you have been transformed," he said. "It seems that you and your Empress are not getting along," Jenna said. "Why is that?" Surprise flickered across his face. Taking her elbow, he drew her closer to the fire. "Please," he said, "sit down." Well, Jenna thought, you did want to talk to somebody who could tell you more about the Empress. She sat in the same cross-legged style as the others had. He gestured toward the teapot. "Would you like some?" "No," Jenna said flatly. He grinned. "It's an acquired taste, but I can make a fresh pot if you like, without spiking it." "No, thank you." He sat down opposite her. "We have some roasted wild turkey and flatbread, if you'd like some." Jenna wavered. It had been forever since she'd tasted bread, and turkey had always been one of her favorites, and she needed to keep her strength up. "How is the turkey cooked?" she asked. Strangford laughed, a genuine, hearty laugh that seemed to come from deep within. "You are a demanding guest," he said. "When someone gives you a sweet cake, do you poke holes in it to check the filling before you take a bite?" "If I thought it might be filled with blood, I might." He laughed again. "I promise that any blood you see belonged to the turkey." Strangford whacked off a slice of meat with his knife, folded it into a piece of bread, and handed it to her. Jenna took a big bite, blotting at the juice that ran down her chin. It was perfect. She took another bite. "I believe we got off on the wrong foot the last time we met," Strangford said. "I'd hoped to pull off a rescue, but King Gerard got in the way." "That was a rescue?" Jenna lifted an eyebrow. "If so, it was a pretty poor one." Strangford grimaced. "I failed, clearly. It was hastily planned and badly executed. But when I got word that the Empress had found a girl with a mage mark, I had to act fast, before she collected you." "So you really don't work for her?" "No," Strangford said. "I really don't." "What do you care what happens between me and the Empress? We'd never even met before you came swaggering into Arden's court." "Because she is hunting me, too." He paused long enough to let that penetrate, then said, "Here, I'll show you." He bowed his head low, took her hand, and pressed it against the back of his neck. She could feel the cobwebbing of metal, the cool hardness of the jewels set into his skin. She pushed forward onto her knees, brushing his hair aside so that she could take a closer look. She guessed it must resemble her own mage mark, though she'd never seen her own. It was an intricate design, with wavelets, jagged bolts of lightning, and towering thunderclouds. "What does this signify? What is your gift?" "I have many gifts," he said, tipping up his chin. "One of them is the ability to influence the wind and weather." Sliding his hand under his shirt, he pulled out an object on a chain and extended it toward her. "Does this look familiar?" Jenna stared at it, then reached out a finger to touch it. It was a piece of a broken pendant, a mariner's compass like her own. She nodded. I had one too, and I'll bet that it fits together with yours. But we'll never know that, because I haven't seen mine since Arden's court. His face fell. Oh, I'd hoped it might offer some clue. Tears prickled in Jenna's eyes. She wasn't alone. She wasn't alone after all. But, what does it mean? Why are we marked like this? And what does she want with us? Jenna couldn't help looking out toward the sea. Strangward shook his head. I don't know. I wish I did. That would help me figure out what to do about it. It came back to her, that last night in the tower, Strangward asking her over and over why the Empress was hunting her. And she thought it was peculiar that he was asking her, because if anyone would know, he should. How old are you, anyway? She asked him. I believe I'm about 17, he said. So we're of similar age, but neither of us knows exactly. Do you know of any others like us? There were 2 others that I know of, Strangward said. They were about our age, I'm guessing. He nodded. Zelly tracked them down and took them back with her to the northern islands, and they haven't been seen since. He shrugged. Now it's possible that they are living lives of leisure as guests at the Empress's court, but you don't believe that? He shook his head. No, I don't. Each time she finds one of us, she grows markedly stronger. It was after she lured one of us to the northern islands that she grew strong enough to break out of there. We cannot afford for her to get any more powerful. Strangward spoke lightly, but Jenna could read the bone-deep fear in him. She also sensed that he knew a lot more than he was saying. Is that why you plan to kill me? Jenna demanded, her voice echoing against the cliffs. The pirate flinched, and he and Tezza exchanged glances. He doesn't realize that I overheard their conversation in my room, when Tezza offered to step in and kill me so that Strangward wouldn't have to, Jenna thought. Strangward had refused, saying that he would do it himself. For all I know, he hasn't changed his plans. My lord, Tezza said quickly, you don't have to. No, Strangward said. You cannot step in and save me every single time. He looked directly at Jenna. The Empress has had several opportunities to kill me, but she hasn't. I believe that whatever her purpose is, she needs us alive. So, I planned to kill you if I couldn't rescue you, because sometimes when a person is desperate, he does desperate things. Right, of course. Jenna stood, dusting off the seat of her skirt. Thank you, Strangward. This has been very informative. I wish you luck staying out of the Empress's way. Strangward blinked at her. Where are you going? I have business of my own, Jenna said. But we need to stay together, the pirate said, so we can work out a way to defeat Celestine. We need to partner up. Maybe I don't want you as a partner, Jenna said. Maybe I don't trust you. I was wrong. I realize that now. I apologize. I can see why you would find it off-putting. When people ruin my life and then try to kill me, yes, I do find that off-putting, Jenna said. Don't you see, if we don't work together, Selly will win, Strangward said. I think I'd rather take that chance than take my chances with you, Jenna said. I cannot take the risk that you will fall into her hands. It's not your risk, Jenna said. It's my risk. I'll decide whether to take it. Strangward's face hardened. I'm sorry, Jenna. I can't let you go. He nodded to his crew, and they moved quickly, encircling her to block her escape. I hope that over time you'll see that Jenna looked past them, down the inlet. "There you are," she said brightly. She gestured, pointing. "Have I introduced you to my friend Cass?" Strangward shook his head, as if impatient with her attempt at trickery. "I promise you, I don't intend you any harm." "I wouldn't worry about convincing me," Jenna said. She pointed. "Convince him." The wide-eyed reaction of his crew finally made Strangward turn to see. Filling the entire ravine, from wall to wall, was an enormous, pissed-off dragon. Flames swam over his hide, and his amber eyes were filled with menace. He drew back his lips, exposing sword-like teeth. Strangward actually did a double-take. His eyes widened, and he gripped his amulet, taking 2 steps back. "I would advise you to drop your hands, Strangward," she said. "Cass is carrying a major grudge against you, and you don't want to give him an excuse to indulge it." Slowly, the pirate dropped his hand. The look on his face was mingled disbelief and admiration. Is that the sun dragon that I—" He leapt back again as the leaves at his feet exploded into flame. "I really don't intend you any harm," Jenna said, "but I'm finding that dragons are not always that easy to reason with." With a bit of a swagger, she walked toward Cass. The pirates silently stepped aside and let her go. They stared as she gently stroked Cass's side. "It seems I have underestimated you," Strangward said. "I get that a lot. We could be powerful allies. Except for the part about watching my back all the time." Fitting her foot into the stirrup, she leapt nimbly into the saddle and looked down at their gaping faces. "Now, as I said, "Jenna, please," Strangward said, speaking low and persuasively. "Give me 2 minutes. This is important." "All right," she said. "Talk to me." "The fact remains that Celestine is here," Strangward said. "Believe me, she is here for us, and any others of our kind. Think of all the trouble she went to in order to track you down in Delphi. She will never stop hunting us. She has ships off the coast as we speak, and an army marching toward Chalk Cliffs. Once she wins the Deepwater port, she'll begin to offload her army. She means to conquer these realms, so that she can destroy our last refuge. It's that important to her." Jenna thought of the army she'd seen, crossing the plateau, and couldn't help shivering. "Her soldiers are blood-sworn slaves, physically enhanced and all but impossible to kill." Strangward paused, and his crew shifted and murmured. "We're going to have to help these wetlanders fight back." "We?" "Starting now. The garrison at Chalk Cliffs won't be expecting an attack from landward. We need to warn them. That's where I was heading when Sally drove me into hiding. There's no way I can get there in time. But you," he pointed at Cass, "you can. It's still going to be really lopsided, but maybe, with a little warning." He's telling the truth, Jenna thought. This time. "All right," Jenna said. "We'll see what we can do." Cass was still eyeing the pirates longingly. "Fry the bastards." "No, Cass." "Please." "No, Cass." "Burn ship." "If you insist." Jenna smiled at Strangward and his crew and said, "Better move aside. We'll need a running start." Strangward and his crew pressed themselves to the cliff face under the overhang. Cass barreled across the sand, then launched into the air. As he passed over the hidden ship, he flamed it from bow to stern. Oops! The foliage piled on top of the ship caught fire readily. Soon flames were pluming high in the air. "Looks like you're going to need another ship," Jenna thought. Cass completed 2 barrel rolls before they turned south and flew toward chalk cliffs. 39. Living on the Edge. Liz picked her way up the rocky trail, avoiding the wet and slippery spots where the spray from the Indio had made the footing treacherous. Madelon walked behind, a measured distance away. 4 of her wolves trailed along behind them. They'd been several miles around the bay, and now they were climbing to the top of the cliffs overlooking the straits. In the week since the interview with the busker, she'd been taking Madelon out walking nearly every day. She knew he'd want to stay in shape, and he deserved to get some fresh air. They both needed to burn off energy, and it was something they could do together, with little risk of kissing. It wasn't that she was worried about what he might do. He was too damned honorable. She was worried that she would be the one to succumb to temptation. That would only reinforce the Southern notion that Northern women were witches and harlots. Not that she cared what Southerners in general thought, but more and more she found herself caring what this particular Southerner thought. There was nothing she could do about the vivid memories of their previous kisses that seemed to bubble up continuously. "Didn't you say that the key is to live in the moment?" That's the excuse people use for foolish behavior. It wasn't a great day for a walk. All the way around the bay, the wind drove sleet into their faces. By now, Madelon knew better than to take her elbow to help her over rough ground, or offer his cloak if the wind-whipped rain and sleet threatened to drive them inside. "If I'm too stupid to bring my cloak, then I deserve to get wet," Liz had told him. "That is how we learn not to be stupid." "That is also a good way to catch cold," Madelon said. "Would you expect me to give you my cloak if you forgot yours?" she asked. And that was the end of it. He was teachable. Liz set a killing pace, but the Ardenine seemed scarcely winded. Eventually they reached the top of the cliff and walked along the edge. Far below, the ocean slammed into the broken rocks as the tide came in. The keep was perched on a rocky promontory that thrust far out into the Indio, guarding the narrows that led into the harbor. Across the straits, the cliffs were fortified and lined with cannon that could fire down on any ships that entered the roads uninvited. At the end of the point overlooking the harbor, a stone wall ran along the edge of the cliff. Liz pointed across the narrow strip of water. "See? That's what I'm talking about." Madelon greeted the sight with a low whistle. "Are those Comptons?" Liz shook her head. "Demis. That gets us faster turnaround on reloading. They're more efficient than yours, too, since we use a closer tolerance to reduce the windage." "Isn't that risky?" "Not if you know what you're doing, and we do." Madelon stared out at the guns for a long while, as if he was either admiring them or memorizing their positions. Then he turned and leaned back against the wall. His hair was a tousle of icy clumps. His cheeks were pinked up from the cold. "Why are you showing me this? Aren't you afraid you're giving away secrets?" "Oh, I have no doubt that General Khan knows about these," Liz said. "He probably has the blueprints tacked up on his wall. That's probably why your Navy hasn't tried a frontal assault through the straits." She paused. "Anyway, I knew you'd be interested, and it might convince you that we know what we're doing, whether we end up allies or enemies. Thank you for showing me." He hunched his shoulders and swiped ice from under his collar. "How do you keep your powder dry up here?" Liz laughed. "I'm not going to tell you all our secrets, Flatlander. I will say that it involves black magic." Madelon looked out to sea, resting his gloved hands on the wall, squinting against the sleet. Then he shifted his stance, turning his back to the wind and looking south. "A copper for your thoughts," Liz said. When he flinched, she knew that he was thinking of home and how to get there. "I was thinking that it isn't a good day to be on a ship," Madelon said, still looking into the distance, where Spirit Gate must be. "It's never a good day to be on a ship," Liz said, with enough heat that the Ardenine turned back toward her and raised an eyebrow. "I don't like ships, or the ocean," she said. When he said nothing, she added, "I hope we'll have word from your father soon." He grunted a response. The silence grew heavy and thick and totally self-conscious, the memory of Queen Court hanging between them, like overripe fruit. Liz could hear the soft voices of the wolves from across the pavilion. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see the shadow of stubble along Matalon's jaw, the smudge of a bruise overlaying his cheekbone, the narrow strip of skin between the top of his collar and his earlobe. All of it, every bit of exposed flesh, seemed to badly need kissing. Liz dug her fingers into the ice and tried to think about cannon. Matalon shifted his shoulders, stamped his feet, stuffed his hands into the pockets of his sheepskin coat, licked his lips, and looked everywhere but at her. "Well, maybe we should—" "Hang on." A flicker of movement had caught Liz's eye. To the northeast, just above the horizon, something was soaring. It looked to be a bird, a very large bird, swooping and diving in and out of the clouds. It seemed almost illuminated. Matalon followed her gaze, squinting. "What is it?" Liz pulled out her glass and trained it on the horizon. "I don't know," she muttered, handing the glass to Matalon. "Are your eyes better than mine?" The creature plunged toward the ocean like a stooping bird, skimmed the waves, and beat its way skyward with a very large fish in its grip. It glittered once in the low sun before it disappeared into the clouds. Matalon handed the glass back. "You would know better than me, ma'am. Whatever it is, we don't have those in Arden." "We don't have them here, either." Liz peered through the glass again, but the winged creature, whatever it was, had disappeared. "It reflected the light like it was jeweled or armored or something," Matalon said. "Does that help?" She shook her head. As she stowed the glass away, she heard a loud bonging, and realized it was the bell that signaled the arrival of a ship. Liz looked out to sea, which extended gray and choppy to the horizon. Empty. When she looked back toward the harbor, she saw that the ship had already slipped through the straits and dropped sails as it headed toward the docks. "It's one of yours," Hal said, with a trace of disappointment. "A gray wolf on a field of white." Could it be Hadley returning with Adrian? Liz's heart beat a little faster. "Let's head back," she said. Liz took the twisty path down from the point, descending at breakneck speed, flying around the turns, with Matalon doing his best to keep up with her. There was no reason to be in such a hurry. She knew it would take a while for the ship to settle in at the dock and offload passengers and cargo. At the bottom of the path, she handed Matalon off to their gray wolf escort and hurried down the quay to where the ship had tied up. It was a 3-masted vessel with a snarling wolf as the figurehead. That, along with the banner, told her everything she needed to know. Hadley's ship was the Sea-Wolf. Now her heart hammered in her ears, and she broke out in a cold sweat. She looked down at herself, at her winter cloak, rimed with ice and smelling of wet wool. She tucked stray bits of hair behind her ears. Her brother's approval had been so important to her when she was little. What would he think of her now? Would he even recognize her? What would she think of him? Their mother had suggested that he was so damaged by what he'd seen and experienced that he had to run away, that she worried he might take his own life. It didn't matter. They'd always been close. They would find a way to fix it together. Liz looked for his head poking up above the others, his mop of red-brown hair. She didn't see him. She began walking toward them, slowly, picking out the people she knew. There was Hadley, directing the crew offloading a small amount of cargo and luggage. She recognized Garrett Fry, who was a colonel in the Highlanders, and the Grey Wolf Talia Abbott. Both were old friends of her parents. There were several others with them, none of whom she recognized. Could he have changed so much? Liz pulled out the small portrait her mother had given her and studied it. No, she would know him if she saw him. Was he still aboard the ship? Maybe he had a lot of belongings to get together. Couldn't somebody help him? Then she saw that they were taking down the gangway. Dread fisted her in the gut. Where was Adrian? Had he refused to come after all? Had they been unable to find him? She accelerated into a run. That was when Hadley turned and saw her. Hadley's eyes widened, her mouth pinched shut, and she turned pale as rough water ice. She looked as if she'd like to turn and run right off the end of the dock in order to avoid facing her. But she didn't. Instead, she broadened her stance, pushed her shoulders back, and waited until Liz all but skidded to a stop in front of her. "Liz," Hadley said. She stopped, cleared her throat. "I didn't know you would be here. Where is Adrian? He didn't come back with you?" Liz looked from face to face. Their faces looked like they'd been hammered flat. Hadley gripped both her hands. "Liz," she said, her face crumpling a little. "Let's go inside where we can talk." "Why?" Liz set her feet. "Just answer my question." No one answered her question. Not out loud, anyway. "Something's happened to Adrian," Liz said. Though she sucked in breath after breath, she still felt starved for air. "We will tell you what we know," Hadley said, squeezing her hands. "But I'm not going to tell you this story standing on the dock. We are going to go somewhere private and sit." Liz ripped her hands free, turned on her heel, and walked landward. Whatever had happened, it wasn't Hadley's fault, she thought. You don't have to kill the messenger. The keep was a bare-bones kind of place, where privacy was hard to find. Liz led the way into the armory, since it was usually deserted at this time of day, except for the weapons master, and she booted him out. She sat down on a bench and rested her hands on her knees, her heart thumping in her throat. The three of them, Hadley, Abbott, and Fry, sat side by side on a bench opposite hers, like students called to account. "Well," Liz said, when nobody spoke up. "So," Hadley said, "we sailed down the coast to Baston Bay and travelled inland from there. But when we arrived at Odin's Ford, we learned that there had been an attack on Adrian's dormitory a few months ago. Several people died. 5 priests, 2 provosts, and 2 dorm masters." She stopped, her voice catching in her throat. 2 students disappeared, Fry finished for her. Adrian was one of the 2 students. "The attack seemed to be centered on Adrian's room," Hadley said, as if to kill any flicker of hope Liz might harbor. "We spoke with Joniah Balthus, the dean of Mistwork. He said that Adrian's bed was soaked in blood. 2 of the dead priests were found in his room." That word penetrated Liz's bleakly chaotic thoughts. Priests? Why priests? Balthus says that they were a radical splinter group within the Church of Malthus that goes around killing wizards and... Hadley's voice trailed off. They waited then, as if Liz might say something back. But she didn't. If she opened her mouth, if she moved a muscle, if she broke out of her frozen state, she might start screaming and flailing, and that she wouldn't do. Of course Adrian wasn't coming back. Of course. She was like a young plebe who kept falling for the same prank. Finally, Liz looked at Fry. "They didn't find Adrian's body?" The grey wolf shook his head. "I'm sorry, Your Highness." "Captain Grey," Liz corrected him automatically. "Who was the other student?" "Her name was Lila Byrne," Hadley said. "Captain Byrne's daughter." "Ah, of course." Liz picked at a scab on her arm, raked at it with her broken fingernails until the blood flowed again. She watched it trickle down her arm. Her gut told her that Adrian was dead, that surely he was dead. But maybe it was because she couldn't stand another empty siege of wondering, waiting, and hoping, of spotting his face in every crowd, of hearing his voice around corners, of treasuring up everything she would say to him when they were together again. "I've done this," she thought. "I'm not doing it again." Liz couldn't shut down the voice in her head that kept repeating, "You could have been together. You could have had these 4 years. And now he's gone, because our own mother knew where he was all along and left him there until our enemies tracked him down and killed him. This is why Mama wanted to keep this secret until Adrian came home. Somehow she knew that this would happen. It was as if Gerard Montaigne had reached his dead hand out of the grave and broken Liz's heart one last time. "One thing you have to say for Captain Byrne," Liz said finally. "He never hesitates to sacrifice a child for the cause. He should have had more children. My mother, too." "I'm sorry, Your Captain," Fry said softly. "This is not the way we saw this operation ending." Hadley cleared her throat. "We are traveling on from here to the capital to let the Queen and Captain Byrne know what we found. You should come with us. You and your mother should be together right now." "No," Liz said. "I mourned for my brother 4 years ago. I'm not going through all that again. I'll just try to forget that any of this happened. When I finish up here, I'll go back to Delphi." "Please," Hadley said. "You should talk to her. I'm sure she and Captain Byrne could answer many of your questions if you give them—" "No," Liz shook her head. "I'd rather pretend that Adrian died in his home city, beside our father, and not far away among strangers." Tears were streaming down Hadley's face now. "What do you want me to tell your mother?" Liz patted her hand, finding herself in the odd position of consoling her. "I just can't go back there right now. The risk is too high that one of us will say something unforgivable. Tell her I'll need a little time." Hadley stared at her, searching her face, as if the Liz she knew had been swapped out for a stranger. "We'll be here a day or 2 before we leave for the capital," Abbott said. "So you can still change your mind. In the meantime, we brought back a small crate of Adrian's personal effects. I thought you might want to go through it." "Thank you," Liz said. "I'd like that." Hadley slid an arm around her. "Let's go find Sasha," she said. 40. Duel. Hal, unable to sleep, lay on his back, his fingers laced behind his head, his brain rattling like a runaway cart from one problem to another. It had been some time since he'd heard the bell in the tower overhead bong 1, but frustration was keeping him awake, despite his long walk through the wind and sleet with Captain Grey. He couldn't complain about his treatment. If he was a prisoner, he was being cradled in an open hand. He knew that hand would close into a fist with another escape attempt. So it wasn't enough to escape the keep. In Delphi, he'd been close to the border, at least. Here there was lots of open space to cover before he reached friendly territory. If it was even still friendly to Madelons. He left his locked quarters only for meals, and for his walks with Captain Gray, which inflicted their own kind of torment. Speaking of which, what or who was she expecting to arrive by ship? Why had she barreled down the steps like there were demons at her heels? He should have a plan by now. Time was wasting, while events in the south went on without him. His father might already be marching on the capital. His mother and sister might be dead. Or worse. He had so many reasons to want to get home, and one reason in particular to stay. He recalled what he'd said to Gray after his bout with Bosley. "Our women are not like you." Nobody was like her, and now maybe he was ruined for anyone else. Meanwhile, she'd made it plain they had no future together. His king had sent him north to die. So far he'd managed to stay alive, but the experience had changed him. Would he even fit in when he went home? "I need to get out of the witchy north," he thought, "before I lose myself, if it wasn't already too late." A noise outside his door made him sit upright. The guards in the corridor seemed to be arguing with someone. A voice rose above the others, shutting the discussion down. "I will see him. I don't care what time it is. Now get out of my way." It was Captain Gray. Hal groped for his breeches, yanking them on hastily. He was just buckling them when the door banged open, and there she was, a bottle in one hand, the other propped against the doorframe. Her shirt was untucked, hanging midway to her knees. She was in her stocking feet, and long strands of hair hung down around her face. Her eyes were deep wells of pain and grief. "Captain Gray," Hal said warily, "it's late." "It is late," she said, her voice a low growl. "It's late. It's too bloody late." Her gaze traveled over his chest and shoulders, lingered there a moment, then seemed to focus. "Where's your shirt?" "Forgive me," Hal murmured. Snatching it up, he pulled it over his head without unbuttoning it. Looking past her, he saw bluejackets milling in the corridor behind her, as if unsure what to do. Gray set the bottle in a corner with exaggerated care. Then she turned and threw her shoulder against the door, slamming it in their faces. As Hal watched in amazement, she dragged a massive brake front over until it blocked the door. She studied it a moment, hands on hips, then spun around to face him. "Now," she said, grabbing up the bottle and thrusting it toward him, "we are going to play a game." Hal eyed the bottle. "A game?" "A riddle game." Hal looked down at the bottle, then back up at Gray, and realized from her slow, deliberate speech that she had been drinking. A lot. "I was just going to sleep," he said. "Could we play tomorrow?" She wagged the bottle in his face. "We're doing this now." He took a step back. "Let's wait until tomorrow." "What's the matter? Are you scared?" "Yes," Hal said honestly. "You're scaring the shit out of me." He took the bottle, tipped his head back, and took a careful swig. Blue ruin. It all but lifted the top of his head off. "Hey, we're not playing yet." She grabbed the bottle back and drank, her throat jumping with each swallow. She thumped it down on Hal's little table and slumped into one of the chairs. "You, sit," she commanded, pointing at the other chair. Hal sat across from her, resting his hands on the tabletop. "Here's the rules," Gray said. "I'm going to ask you riddles, and if you can't answer, you have to take a drink." "Ma'am, I'm really not much for—" "And every time you say ma'am, you have to take a drink." Hal pressed his lips together and waited. "Now then," Gray said, First question. Why are Southerners such assholes?
That's not a riddle, Hal said.
Answer the question.
Why are you trying to pick a fight with me?
You're the only Flatlander within reach.
Hal studied her haggard face. In truth, she looked like she'd been run over by a team of horses. He'd seen that expression before, on some of the men in his command. Ambushed by grief, they had taken to drink in an effort to drown it. It was the face of heartbreak. Did it have to do with the ship that had arrived that afternoon? What's happened? He said. Tell me what's wrong.
That's not an answer.
She pushed the bottle toward him, and it rocked dangerously.
Drink up.
I'm not going to do this, he said, shoving his chair back. I'm going to call for the gods. Crossing to the door, he took hold of the brake front and tried to drag it aside. A flicker of motion caught the corner of his eye before Gray bulled into him. This time, Hal was smart enough to mind his feet, shifting them out of danger at the last minute so she was unable to sweep them out from under him. Even drunk as she was, she came close to rolling him over her shoulder. He wrapped his arms around her in a kind of bear hug and wrestled her to the floor so he could pin down her flailing arms and legs. It took the full weight of his body to keep her down. She was yelling something at him over and over.
Why did you do it? Why did you bastards murder my brother? He was a healer. He never did anyone any harm.
Bewildered, Hal tried to remember what she told him about her family. If he remembered right, her brother had died years ago. Sometimes drink will surface long-buried hurts, like corpses floating out of a flooded graveyard. Hal had seen it before, in taverns and inns, when the hour was late and the ale had been flowing. I'm sorry about your brother, Hal said. Too many people have died in this war. People we can't afford to lose.
Sorry doesn't bring him back,
Gray said, her voice hitching. She'd stopped struggling and now lay on the stone floor, limp and weeping. I know, he murmured. I know. He didn't know exactly, but he could imagine how he would feel if the war took Harper and Robert from him. Though, just now, they seemed more at risk from his own king than from the enemy they were supposed to be fighting. Taking a chance, Hal slid his arms under Gray, leaned his back against the wall, and scooped her onto his lap. She buried her face in his shirt and kept crying, clutching a fistful of the fabric. Gently, he rocked her, smoothing back her hair and kissing her forehead, murmuring whatever came to mind. Eventually she slept, lips slightly parted, tears still leaking from under her eyelashes. He recalled the glib words he'd said to her, the excuse used through history by soldiers standing up for the killing trade. This is war. People die. Even innocents die, unfortunately. He thought about carrying her to the bed, but that was risky in 100 ways. So he sat, cradling her in his arms, thinking that he never wanted to let her go. He heard new voices in the hallway. Someone hit the door hard, and it shifted the brake front a little. 3 more body hits, and the door had slid open enough to let them squeeze through, Talbot in the lead, still rubbing her shoulder. She froze, scanning the scene, the bottle on the table, Hal propped against the wall with Gray snuggled in against him, her fingers tangled in his hair. Talbot raised both hands, palms up, the universal sign for, "What the hell?" Hal motioned Talbot over, and she squatted in front of them. He eased Gray into Talbot's arms. Talbot stood, nodded at Hal, as if acknowledging their partnership, and carried Gray from the room. The other bluejackets moved the furniture back into place and left, closing the door behind them. Happily, they left the bottle of blue ruin behind, and it helped Hal
into sleep. 41. Dragon. Being from Delphi, Jenna was no stranger to cold, nasty conditions, but flying along the frozen coastline to the north was brutal. The wind off the Indio was bone-chilling, and the shore was layered in ice where the waves splashed up. Urgency lent them speed, which drove the cold wind through Jenna's new clothes. The knowledge that she might be too late to save Chalk Cliffs thrummed in her veins. She didn't trust Evan Strangward, but when she closed her eyes, she could see the town in ruins, overrun by the army she'd seen crossing the snowy moor. She believed him when he said that if Celestine won a foothold on these shores, it was bad news for both of them. She was grateful for the heat that constantly seethed beneath Flamecaster's scales. Riding Cass in these conditions was like bellying up to Britt Fletcher's stove in the dead of a Delphian winter, roasting in front, freezing behind. Ordinarily, Jenna loved night flying, soaring over sleeping villages shrouded in snow, their lights like small beacons in the darkness. She and Cass had to be careful not to fly too near the clan lodges. Dogs always seemed to sense their presence and would run along barking in their wake. "Food? You can't possibly be hungry. You had an entire sheep for breakfast." "Sheep mostly wool, not much meat." Tonight, to avoid being spotted, they flew so low that at times it felt like swimming, with walls of foam-flecked waves all around them. In their early days of flying, Cass had sometimes miscalculated, and they would end up plunging into freezing seawater. These days, that was rare. As they flew south, they began to hear an irregular booming sound, and Cass's flight slowed perceptibly. "Guns! Go home! Find sheep!" Jenna tightened her knees along the dragon's spine. "We need to warn them." When she and Cass argued, it was like having a debate with herself. Sometimes it was hard to sort out who was on which side. When they agreed, they were of one mind. Now they could see flashes of light along the escarpment as they approached the white cliffs of the harbor they had seen earlier. Just outside the harbor mouth, a small flotilla was firing back. They flew high, higher, so they would be only a speck in the darkness to anyone below, then swept back and forth across the battle scene several times. The ships were showing no sign of making a run-in, but simply hovered there, just out of range of the cannon on the cliffs, almost as if they had no intention of risking an attack by sea. It's a diversion, Jenna thought, so they don't notice trouble coming from the other direction. "Let's fly west." Cass banked, turned, and they soared back over the shoreline, following the road that led toward the interior. Below, they could see movement, the occasional flash of light off metal, and hear the tread of hooves in the snow that meant that a large company of riders was approaching the town from landward, staying off the road and within the cover of the forest. They must be the ones she'd seen crossing the frozen wastes on the peninsula. Now there could be no doubt about their destination. Strangward had told the truth. What to do? She had to find a way to help, to warn them about the oncoming army, but she couldn't very well land a dragon in the middle of town. By the time it all got sorted out, somebody would be dead. If Cass landed somewhere and Jenna tried to enter the city on foot, she might be too late, or worse, get caught up in the fighting. But how could they send a clear message to the town without putting themselves at risk? 42. Dreams to Nightmares. Hadley and the others left for Fellsmarch the next morning. Liz stayed behind, nursing an awful hangover. This is why I don't drink, she thought. Not much, anyway. From now on, I'm sticking to cider. And maybe ale. Except for special occasions, like when we win the war. She resisted the temptation to send Madelon to Fellsmarch with the travelers. She couldn't remember much about what happened in his quarters. The bits she did remember were a mixture of mortifying and inexplicably tender. The way he talked to her, his voice a low rumble of calm. The kisses he planted along her hairline, each perfect in its own right. The thud of his heart against her back. His eyes, the color of lichen after a rain, fringed with lashes that matched his raven wing hair. For the first time in a long time, she'd felt safe, nestled in Madelon's arms. It wasn't that she was looking for protection. It was more that she could trust that she could close her eyes, knowing he would watch her back. And if they swapped places, she would watch his. But every time she tried to savor the compassionate, tender moments, she'd stumble into something mortifying. And how did she end up in the arms of a Southerner when she'd gone there to, what was it he'd said, pick a fight? That was the thing about Madelon. He seemed steady and easy, almost boring. And then he'd make her do something she never intended to do. He made you do it? Who attacked who? The voice in her head said. I'll bet none of his frail southern flowers has challenged him to a drinking game. Yet on any given night, all over the realm, people were drinking a little too much and saying and doing things they would regret the next day. She wished she could afford to do that and laugh it off. Lys didn't even remember deciding to go to Madelon's room. Hadley and Sasha had sat with her for most of the day in sort of a 3-person wake. The last her friends knew, she'd gone to bed. She knew they blamed themselves now for her excursion the night before. Lys had little to no appetite, and no desire for anything more challenging than a piece of toast and a bowl of porridge, foods she ordinarily refused to eat. Toward the end of the day, she finally fell asleep, fully clothed, lying on top of her bed, but awoke to a persistent pounding at her door. "Go away," she said groggily. "Lys, open up! We're under attack!" Then tell them to go away, Lys thought before she came fully awake. She rolled out of bed, crossed to the door, and wrenched it open. It was Sasha, her hair disheveled, her shirt-tail hanging out from under her uniform tunic, looking like she'd just rolled out of bed too. "Who's attacking us?" Lys said, leaning on the doorframe. "We don't know for sure. There are 3 ships out beyond the harbour mouth, firing at the gun emplacements." "Have they hit anything?" "I don't know. Unless their guns are a lot better than ours, it won't be easy, shooting up at them like that." Lys sat down on her bed and pulled on her boots. A good fight could be the cure for embarrassment and heartbreak. As they hurried down the hallway, Lys could hear the boom of cannon fire. "Who's the duty officer?" "Graves. He's up on the batteries, directing fire." With Sasha at her heels, Lys climbed the steep staircase to the batteries overlooking the straits. As she neared the top, she breathed in the acrid scent of gunpowder and felt the shudder of percussion under her feet. The wind off the Indio lashed Lys's face as soon as she emerged from the staircase. Gouts of flame illuminated the faces of the gunnery crew as they fired the matches. There were 2 fully crewed 24-pounders on this side of the straits, and 2 on the other, which should be plenty, Lys thought, to hold off 3 ships. She peered out to sea, but the weather made it difficult to see anything until the flare of the shipboard guns pinpointed them. Their shots arced harmlessly into the sea, or smashed into the cliffs far below the batteries. Monroe Graves was already hoarse from shouting orders to the gunnery crew across the straits. "What's the news?" Lys asked, struggling to make herself heard over the thunder of the cannon and the howling of the wind. "It didn't take long for them to figure out our range, and they've stayed just outside of it," Graves said, "which means they can't hit us, we can't hit them. So what's the point? We all should have stayed in bed." "Who's across the way?" Lys nodded at the south side batteries. "Bosley." "Have they shown their colors?" He shook his head. "Nah, there's not much point, with them out so far." But why would they do this? They might as well dump their ordnance into the sea.
Target practice, Graves suggested.
Well, tell your gunners that we don't have to answer every barrage. Maybe they've got shot to waste, but we never do.
We'll just keep 'em honest, that's all.
A thought struck Liz. Do you have sentries deployed to make sure small craft aren't landing down below while we're distracted?
Already handled, Captain,
Graves said. Liz leaned her arms on the parapet, watching the bombardment and their half-hearted response. Worry nagged at her. What were they overlooking? It would help if they knew for sure who was out there. Do you have anything that might give us a little light out there so we could get a better look at those ships?
We have some incendiaries, Graves said. Even if the ships are out of range, we can shoot 'em high and they might go off close enough to light them up.
Let's do that, but wait for my go-ahead. Liz found Sasha among the soldiers at the cliffside. Sasha, where's Matalon? Is he in his quarters?
As far as I know,
Sasha said, giving her a narrow-eyed look.
Do you want me to check?
Take a triple to his quarters and escort him up here. I want him to take a look at those ships.
Right away,
Sasha said, bringing her fist to her chest. Hal dreamed that he'd somehow returned home to White Oaks, the White Oaks of his boyhood, when it was more of a manor and less of a fortress. He was walking through the gardens with his little sister Harper, telling her about his adventures in the north. Is it true that the witches in the north ride demons through the skies, looking for wayward children?
If they do, I never saw it, Hal said. They mainly look for wayward grown-ups.
No, they don't, Harper said, lifting her chin. Grown-ups never get in trouble for anything.
Sometimes they do,
Hal said. So, is that just a story parents tell to make their children behave? Harper persisted, glancing over her shoulder to make sure Lady Madelon was nowhere near.
Maybe some do, but I think others truly believe it, Hal said. It's a lot easier to fight monsters than flesh-and-blood people.
No, it's not, Harper said. Everybody knows that monsters are bigger and fiercer than people.
Hal laughed. Did you know that there are people in the north that say we are monsters?
Really?
Harper looked up at him, wide-eyed.
Well, they're wrong.
Maybe,
Hal said. Harper grabbed his sleeve. Do you think it's possible that we are wrong about the Northerners, too?
Maybe,
Hal said. A clamor of metal on metal yanked him out of his well of dreams.
Flatlander!
Somebody shook him roughly.
Wake up!
Hal opened his eyes, squinting against the lantern thrust into his face. He couldn't see who stood behind the lantern.
What? Captain Gray wants to see you, on the double.
Now he recognized the voice. It was Corporal Talbot, Gray's blue jacket shadow. Hal sat up.
What time is it?
Talbot thrust his sheepskin coat toward him.
Put this on, or go half naked, I don't care. I said on the double.
Hal slid into his shirt and the heavy jacket she gave him, and the hat and gloves. She was dressed for the weather, too.
I take it we're going outside, he said.
Talbot grunted in reply. Hal followed Talbot down out of the tower and crossed the drawbridge to the fortifications along the cliffs that gave the port its name.
How is she?
Hal asked.
Who?
Captain Gray. Talbot looked him up and down, then shook her head. You'll see.
Did something happen to her brother?
He asked, as they climbed the treacherous staircase.
I don't know what you're talking about,
Talbot said, then gave him a look that said she did know, but she wasn't going to answer him. Finally, they emerged onto the cliff top, just in time to meet the roar of a 24-pounder.
Who are you shooting at?
He asked, ears still ringing. Talbot pointed.
Ask the captain.
Matalon, Captain Gray said, motioning him to join her at the wall, her manner brisk and businesslike, her eyes fixed out to sea. When he came up beside her, he saw the lines of weariness in her face, the purple shadows under her eyes. She looked like someone grieving and hung over, and still doing her job. She looked like a hero to him. "I'm going to give you some light, and I want you to take a look at some ships out here, and tell me if you can identify them." She signaled the crew on the nearest cannon, and they lit the match on it. Boom! The shell arced high, higher, then exploded far offshore, flooding the ocean with brilliant light. Squinting against the wind, Hal studied the 3 ships silhouetted against the horizon. "Well," Gray said, gracious as always, "are those yours?" Hal watched until the brilliance died and the ships were lost in darkness again. "They're too far away to be certain," he said, "but I would say they are not Empire ships, at least not ships in the regular Navy." Something else caught his eye as he peered into the darkness, something bright streaking across the sky. Another shell? A shooting star? "What's that?" he pointed. "Blood of the martyrs," Gray muttered, suddenly beside him at the wall. "I have no idea." It swooped down like a flaming arrow until it appeared to pass among the masts of the mysterious ships. A faint cracking sound carried across the water, as if it had run into one of the masts. The object turned, growing larger and larger, until Hal realized it was flying directly toward them. "Take cover!" he shouted, pulling Gray down next to the wall, covering her with his body. He was aware of a searing heat and the scent of burning wood as something huge passed close overhead, and then a dull thunk as something dropped onto the pavers. Demons, he thought, sweat trickling down his back despite the cold. Flying demons. I knew it. Hal didn't really believe that, but was having trouble coming up with another explanation. He covered his head with his arms, waiting for an explosion, wondering if he'd end his life here at Chalk Cliffs as bits of shark bait in the sea. But nothing happened, and after a moment he cautiously propped up and looked at what had fallen onto the cliff top. It appeared to be the mast from a ship, ripped loose and trailing broken rigging. Hal scrambled to his feet and lunged toward the mast, but Captain Gray beat him to it, pawing through the debris and coming up with a banner bearing a death's head on it. "Pirates!" Talbot said, running her finger over the emblem Gray displayed. "It's coming back!" somebody shouted. Hal spun around to see the flying creature bearing down on them, from landward this time, clutching something in its claws. As it flew over the batteries, it let go, and again something hit the ground with a sickening thud. This time, it was a man. Hal could tell from the way the body was splayed on the pavement that he wasn't going to get back up. They gathered close around the body. It looked to be that of a soldier, bristling with weapons, dressed for the cold. As Hal watched, Talbot pulled a curved blade from a scabbard at the man's belt and held it up for them to see. "Pirate?" Talbot said again, but Hal knelt beside the broken body and saw that the man wore boots that had spurs attached, and he smelled strongly of horse and dried sweat. "Whoever he is, he came by horse," Hal said. "But where would he have come from? And is the flying beast on their side or ours?" "Look!" Gray pointed skyward. The winged creature was flying in a tight maneuver, spitting flame and smoke, leaving a trail in the sky. Some kind of emblem. "It's an arrow," Talbot said. "Pointing west," Gray said, swiveling to look in the direction it pointed. Hal followed her gaze, looking over the town to the western wall. Beyond that, darkness. "Graves!" Captain Gray shouted. "Sound the alarms! I want as many soldiers as possible on the city walls to landward. I think this bombardment is a diversion from the real attack." "Yes, Captain." Graves left at a dead run. Somewhere below, alarm bells began to clamor. When Hal scanned the sky, the flaming beast had disappeared. Gray turned toward Talbot and Hal. "Talbot, I want you to take Matalon to the cell block in the tower. Post a triple guard on him. If it turns out that our visitors are coming after him, I'm not going to make it easy." "But, Captain, I could help," Hal said, frustration boiling up in him. "I told you, those aren't Empire ships. Give me a weapon and I'll—" "Not this time, Captain," Gray said, turning away. 43. Too little, too late. It was clear from the beginning that this battle would be different from any Liz had fought before. She'd always fought in the field, where she used the terrain to her advantage, and mobility was a major part of her battle strategy. Advances, retreats, flanking movements, ambushes, they were all tactics she employed. While she was grateful for the protection of the keep, it was also a trap. There were no advances, only retreats. This enemy was different, too. Liz was used to fighting Arden's mercenaries and unwilling recruits, most of them already in a lather about going up against demons and witches. These were fierce, hardened warriors, with curved blades, who were all but impossible to kill. When Liz cut off the head of one of them, he kept coming until she took off his legs as well. It was as if they were possessed, as if they didn't feel pain and embraced death with a will. The soldiers were not Ardenine, though they could be mercenaries hired by Arden. These didn't fight like mercenaries, though. If they were pirates, they were like none Liz had ever heard of before. She thought of pirates as masters of the hit and run, the claiming of soft targets. As Hadley had said, pirates don't like targets that shoot back. Chalk Cliffs was not a soft target, but these pirates kept coming. Whatever drove them, it was scary as hell. The warning they'd received gave them time to close and secure the gate before the first wave of enemy horsemen penetrated the town wall. It soon became clear that some of the enemy were already inside, maybe the strangers the garrison had worried about. They erupted from hiding, often killing dozens before they were put down. The town's strongest fortifications faced the ocean, not the landward side, and the high ground to the west allowed the attackers to rain arrows and incendiaries down on their heads. Liz put the townspeople to work, putting out fires and wetting down the buildings. The keep's big guns were placed to fire down on ships attacking from the sea, but the enemy ships remained far outside the harbor, no doubt waiting for the land attack to soften up the defenses and disable the cannon before they ventured in. Eventually, the Highlanders were able to rotate the cannon in their emplacements and fire across the city and take out some of the enemy weapons. Wizard Flame might have been effective against them, but they'd never know, because the gifted were elsewhere, mainly in Delphi, where they'd helped take the city. Liz dearly wished she could have them back again. She ordered birds sent to Fortress Rocks and Fellsmarch, even though she knew that any response would be too late to save the town. Sasha was beside herself because she couldn't keep Liz off the walls and out of the fight, and because she couldn't come up with a foolproof escape plan either. With pitched battles filling the streets and fires raging in many of the buildings, Sasha finally managed to force Liz into the keep. "You need to get out, Your Highness," she said. "You need to leave while you still can." "I don't think that was ever possible," Liz said. "By the time we knew what was happening, we were surrounded." "Why are you working so hard to protect Captain Madelon while you put yourself at risk? Who do you think is more important to the future of the Queendom, him or you?" "I'd rather go down fighting than be killed sneaking out of the back gate." "What about the front gate?" Sasha said. "Leave by boat." "No, not possible. Out of the question." "Did you see those ships out there? How far do you think we would get?" "They're staying out of range of our cannon," Sasha said. "The weather's dark and miserable. Take a small boat, go out through the straits, hug the shoreline, and follow along until you reach a safe place to land." "No," Liz said briskly. "Now, if there's nothing else, I'd better get to—" "I know you don't like boats, but—" "I'll die on dry land, thank you," Liz said. Already her bowels were turning to water, and she tasted metallic panic on her tongue. Once again she saw the water closing over her head, felt the smothering pressure of it, her lungs screaming for relief.
What would be worse, going out on a boat or being captured by Arden?
I don't mean to be captured, Liz said grimly.
You owe it to your mother, the Queen, to survive,
Sasha shouted at her. You mean the mother who lied to me? Who betrayed me? Who let me think my brother was dead all these years, when I could have been with him, or at least said goodbye? Liz thought all that, but she didn't say any of it, because she knew in her heart of hearts that it was unfair. So all she said was, "No." It was a triumph that she kept her voice from trembling. Sasha gripped her shoulders and shook her.
What about your father? What would he want you to do? Would he want you to sacrifice yourself and leave your mother all alone? Or would he want you to protect the Grey Wolf line? Do you want him and your brother and sister to have died for nothing?
That's not fair, Liz muttered. That is totally not fair.
What's the old saying about love and war? If you're gone, then so's his line. Now come on, we'll go down to the cellar dock. You can slip right out of the keep and into the boat with nobody the wiser.
No.
Don't make me knock you on the head and load you in the boat like a barrel of saltfish, Sasha warned.
Liz had no doubt that she would do that if she could. She sighed, a long exhale of surrender. You win, Liz said. I'll try the boat, but you're coming with me.
No, Sasha blurted. I mean, you go ahead, and I'll follow a little later. I just need to kill a few more mudbacks, or whatever they are, and then
I'm not going if you're not going. I'll need your help. We're taking Matalon and the busker.
What? Have you lost your mind?
Sasha's expression said that she probably had.
The two of them will cut our throats and push us over the side.
I'm counting on you to prevent that, Liz said. I still think the busker can help us figure out who's behind these killings, and I'm not giving up on Matalon if he might help bring some of the southern Thanes over to us. Liz paused. Since you like quoting my Da so much, here's another of his favorite sayings. Take or leave. Brian wasn't sure how long he'd been hearing the sound of cannon fire. For a while it came fast and furious, but then it dwindled to an occasional vibration in his breastbone. Maybe the battle was still going on, but it was hard to tell, locked in a dungeon. He'd never been in a battle before, so that was interesting, especially since, at the moment, he was out of the line of fire. Still, it was lonely down here in the cell block, where there were no other prisoners, and even the guards hadn't been very sociable. They made sure he was fed and watered, and they emptied his chamber pot, but that was all. He needed something to take his mind off his worries. He was a very creative worrier. Unless Aubrey had brought an army to save him, it really didn't matter to him personally who won. Prisoners didn't usually fare well in wartime. They were a complication nobody needed. He tried to sleep, but he couldn't, what with the cannon fire and distant shouting and worrying and the faint nagging craving for a hit of leaf. No, he was going to die clean if it came to that. At least this jail was different from others he'd been in. Not that he was an expert. Most cells were like cold, damp, dark closets with thick wooden doors and little peepholes. These were built of stone, but the fronts were a grid of iron bars that let the light and air in. If he craned his neck, he could see all the way up and down the hall. There'd been nothing to see for a good long time. After a while he heard somebody coming, footsteps and the rattle of keys. He sat up. Long shadows preceded the newcomers down the corridor between the cells. They seemed to be arguing.
"Put a sword in my hand and let me fight," one of them was saying. "You need every able-bodied man on the walls. I'm not any good to anyone down here." "No offense, but nobody wants to be fighting next to a slimy-assed southerner."
No offense, Brian thought. Even the most thick-skinned person might—
"It doesn't matter who they are," the first man persisted. "They are no friends of mine. I can help."
Let him help, Brian thought. if he's crazy enough to want to.
Save your breath, one of the jailers said. I'd be glad to make that trade with you, Matalon, but Captain Grey ordered us to lock you down here, and that's what we're going to do.
They unlocked the cell across the way from Brion's, pushed the prisoner inside, and locked the door behind him.
I hope you rot down here, the chatty one said.
Then they both trooped back through the corridor and up the stairs. Brion's new neighbor swore at their backs, and then paced around his cell a bit, as if he hoped that he might find a tunnel out or an extra set of keys.
Hey,
Brion said. The man spun around and groped at his hip, as if he was used to finding a sword there.
If it was up to me, I'd have let you fight. You look like you'd be good at it.
The other man gripped the bars of his cage and peered across at him. He was tall and muscular, the kind that would be called well-made if you were going for a military look.
Unfortunately, the man said in Ardenine-accented common, you are not in charge. I'm Brion de Tarvos, Brion said. I'm a musician, wrongly imprisoned for a crime I didn't commit.
Maybe it was early to be bringing that up, but he didn't want his new neighbor to get the wrong idea, that he was a criminal or something.
Call me Brion.
The soldier eyed him, as if trying to guess what crime he'd been accused of.
Halston Matalon, prisoner of war. I go by Hal. What's going on out there? Brion asked. Who are we fighting, and are we winning or losing? Hal's jaw tightened. The horsemen wear no uniform or signia, but the ships besieging us carry a death's head banner. Pirates, then, Brion said, feeling an odd quiver deep in his belly. Or line soldiers pretending to be pirates.
Brion hated to push his second question, but he did.
So, how is it going?
Hal shook his head.
Short of a miracle, I'd say we're done for. I'm going to be on the losing end of my second battle in a month. If they won't let you fight, they can't blame you, can they?
Brion thought that was a reasonable deduction, but Hal just shook his head and kept prowling, examining the places where the bars met stone, maybe hoping for a gap he could wriggle through. With those shoulders, though.
They are pretty well built, these are,
Brion said, slapping his palm against the bars.
Not that I'm an expert, being law-abiding and all.
After pacing and muttering a while longer, Hal finally seemed to give up, and he sat down, slumping against the wall.
What is it you're accused of that you didn't do?
He said. Brion guessed that Hal really didn't care, that he was just being polite, but it was nice of him to ask.
They think I conspired to kill the Princess Alyssa, he said.
Hal turned his head to look at him.
You?
Brion nodded, unoffended.
Hard to believe, isn't it?
Why do they think it was you?
Well, it's true that I was there when it all went down, Brion said, but I had no idea what was going to happen. The princess keeps coming down here and trying to get me to finger the people behind it, but I can't tell her what I don't know.
That got Hal's attention. The Princess Alyssa was here?
Brion nodded. Still is, as far as I know.
She couldn't be here, Hal said with conviction. We're all going to be slaughtered. Brion was finding out that Hal was a pessimistic sort.
She's a tough military kind of princess. She's probably out there in the thick of the fighting.
Brion paused, and when Hal kept frowning and studying on it, added,
I mean, it's possible she left. Last I saw her was dinner time yesterday.
Yesterday? But why haven't I seen her then?
Brion shrugged. Don't feel bad. She's a busy person, and I guess she has to focus on the important prisoners. Maybe there's nothing she wants to pry out of you.
Hal chewed on this a while, then straightened a little and said, This princess, what does she look like?
Well, she's very tall and long-shanked, with hair the colour of pale caramel. Lately she's had it done up in a fat braid with... Saints and martyrs,
Hal swore, glaring up at the ceiling.
Why didn't I see it?
So you have met her? Hal nodded. He had the stricken face of a man who's looked back along the path he's on and discovered he's been walking on very thin ice, with no way to go back.
You know what always helps when I...
Brion's sentence trailed away as he heard quick footsteps approaching and the rattle of keys. He stood, craned his neck, and peered down the hallway. It was Her Highness, with Sasha. Grim looks on their faces, bags slung over their shoulders, and armed to the teeth. Sasha unlocked the door to Brion's cage and tossed the keys to Her Highness so she could do the honors for Hal. Hal kept staring at the princess, like she might strip off a mask and turn into somebody else right in front of him.
Let's go, busker,
Sasha said, handing him the kind of warm, waterproof coat that fishermen and sailors wear.
Put that on and bring your belongings.
Where are we going? Brion said, sliding into the coat.
The enemy is inside the keep, so we're going for a boat ride.
44. Ships in the Night.
You're a fool, Halston Madelon,
Hal told himself as Captain Gray and Corporal Talbot ushered him and Brion down 2 more flights of stairs.
You'd better stick to fighting, where at least you have a little skill.
The Grey Wolf, they called her. Hal had been hearing that name for years. She was a legend on both sides of the border, known as a fierce and savvy fighter. The Grey Wolf was Captain Gray. Of course she was. Also Alyssa Anaresa, the heir to the Grey Wolf throne. Also Lys. As he thought on it, as fragments of conversation came back to him, his mortification grew. Hal blithely assuring her that, as soldiers, their lives wouldn't change much, no matter who sat on the throne. Hal suggesting that a royal marriage might put a big fat bow on the peace accord. How could he ever look her in the eye again? How much of what had happened between them was real? Had she been laughing at him behind a facade of eager kisses and embraces? No. For someone who'd been lying to him from the day they met, she was the most honest person he knew. Hal peered sideways at Lys, looking for some evidence of royalty that he'd missed before. He saw none of that. In fact, she looked as pale and wretched as he'd ever seen her. She looked like she might faint dead away at any moment. His heart went out to her, despite the fact that she'd made a fool of him.
"Are you well, Captain?"
he said, resisting the temptation to take her arm.
"Fine,"
she whispered unconvincingly.
"Couldn't be better."
The farther they descended, the damper it was. Hal could smell the sea and hear the crash of waves against the walls of the keep. On the lowest level was a small dock, protected from the weather, likely meant to allow the offloading of people and supplies, without the risk of being smashed against the cliffs. Several small boats were tied up there, rocking in the waves that found their way inside. Talbot tossed their kit bags into the largest of the boats, carefully distributing the weight.
"You sit up front, Captain,"
she said, putting out a hand to help her into the boat.
Could I sit in the middle?"
"I thought we'd put these 2 midships to handle the oars. I'll sit in the back and keep an eye on them. That leaves the bow."
"Oh," Gray said miserably. She put out a foot as if to step into the boat, then yanked it back.
"What if we barred the doors and hid down here? If they're pirates, they'll likely just steal what they can and leave again."
"Get into the boat, Lys,"
Talbot growled.
"Now."
She's frightened, Hal thought. She's absolutely terrified. That was when he remembered what she'd said.
"I don't like ships or the ocean."
Gray edged forward again, and this time Talbot half lifted her into the boat. She crawled toward the front and huddled in the bow. Hal followed her in, and then Brion did, each claiming a thwart and a pair of oars. Talbot cast off and climbed in last, shoving the craft away from the dock. It was tricky, navigating out through the water gate, rounding the corner and putting their backs into it to open space between the boat and the cliffs so they wouldn't risk smashing up before they even got started. This coastline was treacherous under the best of conditions, but now it seemed like a gale was coming out of the northeast. It didn't help that they were in such a tiny boat. They'd go down into the trough and then go up over the crests like a cork. The good news was that in these seas there was little risk they could be spotted from the ships lurking offshore. To Hal's surprise, Brion was a capable oarsman, better than Hal, in fact. Clearly he'd done rowing before, but where would a street musician get that kind of experience? Brion kept shooting looks over his shoulder at Gray. When Hal stole a look, he saw that she had her head down, eyes closed, keeping a white-knuckled grip on the gunnels, as if that way she could pretend she was somewhere else.
"Do you think she's going to hurl?"
Brion whispered to Hal, nodding toward Gray.
"We're not even into the bay."
Shaking his head vigorously, Hal mouthed no to the busker. Maybe she would, and maybe she wouldn't, but Hal didn't want to give her any ideas. Fortunately, the tide was in their favor, and they had very little rowing to do on their way through the straits, just what was required to keep them off the cliffs to either side. He could still hear the boom of cannon from the cliffside batteries and see the ruddy flashes on the horizon that he knew was answering fire from the enemy ships. Hal tried to look up to the top of the cliffs, slitting his eyes against the rain and sleet to see whether anyone was still fighting up top. He couldn't tell. Already his shoulders were burning, protesting against the unusual strain after weeks of idleness. They were close to the exit into the open bay, and now Hal could hear waves crashing against the cliffs ahead. Talbot stood in the stern, guiding them by screeching when they seemed likely to ram into the rocks. Finally, they were around the corner and pulling against the force of the flowing tide. Their little craft rocked wildly in the currents, and he could hear something rolling on the floor under his feet, and Gray whimpering behind him. Eventually, as they left the straits behind them, the rocking eased. It was still rough, even in the bay, but manageable between him and Brion. They followed the coast to the northeast, hoping they could get out of the bay without venturing close enough to the enemy ships to be spotted. It was, all in all, a long, miserable night. They almost capsized when they left the bay for the open sea, but managed to ease around a point of land and into the shelter of the shoreline again. Hal transitioned from burning pain to a kind of numb acceptance, his body reacting automatically to the demands of the oars, while his mind strayed to the possibility of escape. If he could get away from the others, he would still be in the fells, but he ought to be able to blend in well enough to make his way south eventually. Assuming they landed someplace close enough to civilization that he didn't die of exposure before he found shelter. At some point during the night, Brion slumped from his seat and into the bottom of the boat, overcome by exhaustion. Without a word, Captain Gray scrambled back, seized his shoulders, and pulled him forward, draping him over the thwart so he wouldn't drown in the water sloshing in the bottom of the boat. Draping an oilskin over him, she replaced him on the forward set of oars. For a princess, she's not much of a complainer, Hal thought. This was somehow reassuring, that the fierce Felsian captain he'd fallen for was still there. At least this way it'll keep her blood moving so she doesn't freeze to death. Finally, toward morning, the storm abated, and they found a little inlet to shelter in. Hal and Talbot and Gray bailed out as much water as they could, huddled together for warmth, and unrolled the sail over top. Despite the cold and all his aches and pains, Hal slept like a dead person. 45. Castaways. When Hal awoke, the brief winter's day was well underway. He realized that Gray was snuggled up against him, her face buried in his chest, her breath warming him through his wool tunic. One long leg was thrown over his hip, and, anyway, there was no more sleeping after that. The princess slept restlessly, muttering under her breath, her limbs twitching violently like she was still fighting her personal war in her sleep. Every time she moved, Hal's treacherous body reacted. When he could stand it no longer, Hal eased away from her and sat up. Now something was jabbing him in the backside. He reached down and found a long object carved from ivory, decorated with sea monsters and dragons. The finger holes along its length told him that it was a sailor's flute. It was beautiful work, and he wondered who might have left it there. His sister Harper would love it, he knew, if he ever had a chance to give it to her. Don't think like that. You will. Sliding the flute into his coat, he poked his head out from under the canvas. Talbot was ashore, having cleared the ice from a patch of sand and built a fire. She'd hung wet clothing over branches to dry and was drinking from a steaming mug. Brion was up too, sitting on a boulder, cradling something in his arms, mourning over it like it was a dead child.
"Will you get over it, busker?" Talbot growled. "Put that thing down or give it a decent burial. You're alive. You should be thanking the Maker for that instead of complaining." "It was my father's," Brion said. "It's all I had of his. It was just repaired, and now it's ruined again. It got soaked, and the joints are coming apart."
"Come on now," Talbot said gruffly. "It's a new day. I've some hot tea for you, and you can soak your hardtack in it, and I've got an end of cheese. You worked real hard rowing that boat last night, and you must be hungry." Brion shook his head. "I'm not hungry." He rubbed the back of his neck and winced. "I don't feel so well, and my neck hurts something fierce." "You probably pulled a muscle or something," Talbot said. "It's more like it's burning," Brion said. He fingered it again. "Something's wrong. I can feel it." Talbot levered herself to her feet. "Here, you want me to take a look at it?" Now he clapped both hands over the back of his neck. "No," he said. "Never mind." "Suit yourself," Talbot said, shrugging. "I'll be back in a little while." "Where are you going?" Brion asked. "The latrine, since you had to know." And she disappeared into the woods. Hal climbed out of the boat. "What's ruined, Brion?" he said. "My Jafasa," he said, turning his attention back to the object on his lap, stroking it gently. "Talbot took it on the boat, and now it's ruined." Hal squatted next to him. He was no expert, but it looked beyond repair. "I never heard of that, a Jafasa." "It's a musical instrument from Carthus," Brion said, blotting his eyes with his sleeve. "My father taught me to play." "Your father's gone now, I take it," Hal said. Brion nodded. Talbot was right. What with everything else, it didn't make sense to be mourning over a broken musical instrument. But the busker's pain was obviously real. Hal cast about for something to say, but he'd never been all that good with words. Groping in his pocket, he brought out the carved flute. "I'll probably never get home anyway," he thought. "Here," he said, thrusting it toward Brion. "It's not the same, I know, but maybe this can be a reminder, somehow, of this conversation about your father." For a moment, he thought the busker would refuse. Then Brion reached out and took the flute from his hands. "Thank you," he said, stroking the fantastical carving. "I've always been partial to the flute. My father played the sailor's pipe sometimes." Looking a little brighter, he tucked it away in his bedraggled coat and took a trip to the woods himself. Even though it looked hopeless, Hal rewrapped the Jafasa in its oilskin and found a spot for it in the boat. He didn't want to get the busker's hopes up, but maybe something could be done with it when they reached safety. "It's late! Why didn't anyone wake me up?" Gray clambered out of the boat, all but tipping it over, and waded to the shore. She scanned the beach and, apparently seeing that they were unsupervised, said, "Where's the busker? And Talbot?" I'm right here, Talbot said, emerging from the trees, followed by Brion. Nobody's going anywhere. You can't walk more than 100 paces in any direction without running into a cliff. The only way out of here is the way we came in.
Then we'd better be on our way, Gray said, scanning the cliff tops above them. We'll find a place to put in where we can find a path inland. She didn't look happy about putting out to sea again, but she seemed resigned to it anyway. Hal rolled his aching shoulders, hoping this leg of the journey would be a little easier.
Have a seat, Brion said, gesturing toward the boulder he'd vacated. I'll have a look at the sailing rig. Once we reach open water again, we'll make better time if we can find the wind.
Stepping into the boat, he began wrestling with the lines.
Need any help, Busker?
Talbot said. Within the hour, they were on their way again. Once they'd eased out into the bay, Brion hoisted the sails. Hooking his feet under a center cleat, he held the tiller in one hand and the lines in the other, ducking under the boom as if he'd spent his whole life lashed to a mast. Why would a busker seem so at home in a sailboat? The sun broke out of the clouds, and the winds freshened out of the south, so they made good progress. Even Gray had a little more color in her cheeks. But Brion kept fingering his neck and scanning the horizon, his face clouded with worry. They were an hour out when Talbot said, "We've got company." It was a good-sized ship, running parallel to the shore, and it was rapidly closing the distance between them.
"Maybe," Talbot said, "it's one of ours."
But she didn't sound hopeful. From the looks of the ship, Hal guessed she was one of the vessels they'd seen outside the harbor at Chalk Cliffs.
"How did they find us so quickly?" Hal muttered. "It should have taken them a day or two at least."
"What I don't get is why they would leave off sacking the city to come after us," Gray said, studying the busker, narrow-eyed, as if he might have the answer. Brion just stared at the ship with a bleak expression, as if he was looking death in the face. The boy was a puzzle, but it wasn't Hal's to solve. When he looked toward land, he saw that they'd left the high cliffs behind, so the shoreline here was a little more accessible. Still, he wasn't optimistic. They had no gear, no horses, no food. It was likely they'd be hunted down before they could get any distance from the shore.
"Let's find a place to land," Talbot said. "Once we're ashore, hopefully we can find a hidey-hole and they'll give up."
"They won't give up," Brion said, adjusting the mainsail in order to capture a little more wind, and scrambling from one side of the boat to the other as they came about.
"Well, you're Mr. Cheerful, aren't you?" Talbot said, forcing a laugh. "Can everyone swim?"
the busker asked abruptly. Everyone nodded but Gray, who turned the color of green foam.
"Don't worry," he said. "You won't have to swim far."
He leaned forward, talking fast and persuasively.
"If we land, they'll know right where we are. So here's what we'll do. See that rocky point up ahead? I'm going to bring us as tight into there as I can. When I give the word, the rest of you are going to slide out of the boat and swim for shore, and I'm going to sail her on a little farther before I abandon ship. Hopefully they'll follow the boat." "But then they'll catch you," Talbot said.
"Maybe he wants to be captured," Gray said. They all turned and looked at her. "Maybe our pirates are in league with the busker," she said, nodding toward the enemy ship. "Maybe the attack on the keep was an effort to free him." Brion stared at her, momentarily losing track of the sails, which spilled air and began flapping. He jerked a thumb seaward. "You think I've got an army and a shipload of pirates at my beck and call?" Gray rolled her eyes. "Doesn't anyone else think it's odd that a busker climbs into a jolly boat and magically turns into a sailor?" Brion laughed bitterly.
"I'll tell you right now, nobody's got my back. I landed in Fellsmarch with 3 friends, and now 2 are dead, and the 3rd disappeared. These days, if I got all my friends together, they'd be lucky to fill a privy."
"Really? I used to have a family, busker, and now it's down to my mother and me."
"Fine," Brion said.
I confess, you nailed me. It's just an elaborate scheme to escape.
Could we talk about this later? Hal said. They'll be on top of us before we know it. If we're going to do something other than surrender, we'd better do it now. Brion lunged across the boat, grabbed the lines, shoved the tiller, and they came about so they were slanting toward the point.
Do whatever you want. I'm going on in before they get close enough to count heads. I'll say the word when we're as close as we're going to get, and that's when you jump.
He glanced back at Grey.
I promise that if I survive, I'll turn myself in and submit to the Queen's justice.
Matalon, Grey said. Hal leaned toward her. What is it? To his surprise, she gripped his shoulders and kissed him, hard and thoroughly, while everyone else in the boat gaped at them. In case this is goodbye, she said. I'm sorry about a lot of things, but I'm not sorry that we met. I've learned a lot, and... She swallowed hard, and tears spilled down her cheeks. I'm just sorry that we had to meet as enemies. It's not goodbye, Hal said stubbornly. By now it was shallow enough that Hal could see rocks coming up under the wind-ruffled surface. The busker loosed the sails, dumping out air, slowing their forward progress.
Everybody ready?
When just a few yards of turbulent water separated their boat from the point, he shouted,
Now!
Hal rolled over the side and into the stunningly cold water. He kept his head under water as he took a few strong strokes toward shore. The next thing he knew, he was running up against the rocks in the shallows. Though he wanted nothing more than to haul himself out onto dry land, he came up for a breath, then submerged again, holding his breath so as not to be spotted before the jolly boat got well away. Finally, he broke the surface, gasping, and looked seaward. Their little boat was already far to the north, racing along the shoreline under full sail. The enemy ship had turned north with it, following along parallel in the deeper water. Hal crawled out of the water and onto the shore, scraping his hands and knees on the rocks. He spotted Talbot a short distance away on hands and knees, coughing out seawater. He looked up and down the point.
Where's Captain Grey? He said.
I haven't seen her since I jumped out of the boat, Talbot said.
I all but drowned in these currents.
The bluejacket pushed to her feet, shaded her eyes, and surveyed the shoreline, then scanned the waves that smashed diagonally into the rocks.
Liz! She cried. Liz, where are you? Answer back so I can get a fix on your location.
But there was no response. Hal looked down the shoreline in the direction the current was running, but saw nothing. Brion de Tarvos and the pursuing ship had rounded a bend and were out of sight.
I should have kept a hold on her,
Talbot said, a quiver in her voice.
Or we should have stayed with the boat. This is my fault. I know she's afraid of the water.
Maybe she just got swept farther down the beach. Let's follow the shore and maybe we'll find her.
But what if she comes here looking for us, and we're gone?
Talbot said. We could split up, Hal suggested. When Talbot glared at him, he added, Would it help if I gave you my word of honor that I won't try to escape?
We stay together, Talbot said.
Let's go. 46. Beach music.
You were supposed to jump off the boat,
Brion said, looking over his shoulder to where Her Highness cowered in the stern.
I was going to, she said, teeth chattering. I really was, but I changed my mind.
With that, she finally let loose and spewed over the side, then hung there, arms draped around the oarlocks, head down. They were speeding along, faster than it seemed possible to go in such a small boat. It should have taken every ounce of Brion's concentration to keep the boat moving and avoid a miscalculation that would leave them in splinters up on the rocks. And yet, in a way, handling the sails and managing the boat was like breathing. The scent of the salt spray was intoxicating. It went to his head like a hit of leaf. He wondered if he'd been using the leaf as a poor replacement for this.
"You're really good at this,"
Her Highness said, as if reading his thoughts.
"I know,"
he said. It wasn't bragging, it was the truth. It was just the latest in a long line of surprises, good and bad. On the other side of the ledger, the mage mark on the back of his neck. Right now it burned like fury. He didn't remember it ever doing that before.
"How did you learn to sail?"
"I don't know," he said.
"But you should have jumped when you had the chance."
"I didn't want you to get away," she smiled weakly. Dread rose in his throat like black bile, and he swallowed it down. He'd never been one to barf aboard ship, and he wasn't going to start now.
"In fact, you did want me to get away," he said. "As far away as possible. They'll murder you."
He nodded toward the ship.
"Your friends?"
He shuddered.
"They're not my friends."
"Who are they?"
"I don't know."
"You really should have given up the leaf a long time ago," she said, regaining some of her usual know-it-all prickliness.
"That's not the problem," he said. "I didn't lose my memory because of using leaf. I used leaf because of the things I can't remember."
For instance, he didn't know why the woman on the ship was looking for him, but he knew now that he didn't want her to find him. By now, the black ship had outpaced them and turned in toward the shore, so she lay to the leeward side of them. As he watched, the ship began dropping a litter of jolly boats.
"Should we turn around?"
Her Highness said, strapping on her baldric and methodically arming herself with all manner of weapons.
"Won't do any good, strong as this sea is running. It's time to go ashore and hope we can give them the slip. Can you get on the oars again?"
Without a murmur of protest, she edged forward to the rearmost thwart and began pulling with a will, as if anything that got her onto dry land quicker was worth the sweat.
"Now," he said, "as soon as we run aground, jump out and run, and don't look back. If we split up, maybe one of us will get away."
She grunted, which left him in the dark as to what she'd actually do. But when they hit the shallows, she vaulted over the side of the boat and took off running, disappearing into the jumble of broken rock that lay between the beach and the mountains beyond. Good, he thought. That was one worry off his plate. Maybe she hated him, but he didn't hate her. He felt bad about what had happened to her family. Who could blame her for wanting justice? I'm a lover, not a hater, he thought. 2 boats were pulling hard for the shore, closing in on him. Now what? He took off in a different direction than the princess had gone, threading his way into a labyrinth of rock so that he couldn't be spotted from the water. He got to a point where he had to begin climbing, trying to find toe holds, reaching, gripping stone, pulling himself up. Eventually, he came to an overhang and he could go no farther. So he settled onto his perch, huddling deep in his coat, and waited. Soon he heard voices from the beach, so he knew the boats must have landed. After another little while, he heard the voices moving closer, felt the mage mark on the back of his neck burning, burning, burning. Something about the lay of the land funneled voices up to him. He heard a woman's voice, as warm and intoxicating as hot buttered rum.
"It's this way. We're getting close now."
He could hear the excitement in her voice. And then another voice, one he recognized, high and anxious.
"You won't hurt him, right? You said you wouldn't hurt him. You're just going to take him back home on your ship."
It was Aubrey. And then the first voice, larded with sorcery. "Of course," she said. "That was the bargain, wasn't it? I am going to take very good care of your mage-marked friend." For one hopeful moment, Brian wondered if the story he'd made up was true, if Aubrey was bringing an army to save him. But no, He knew in his heart of hearts that wasn't Aubrey's style, that she could never pull that off. In his heart of hearts, he knew that it meant that she'd betrayed him. Just for a moment, then, he put his head down and surrendered to despair.
"We'll be fine," she'd said. "I'll get my game going as soon as we get to Baston Bay."
Was this why she'd talked him into returning to Baston Bay? Was he the prize in the new game she had going?
"I was loyal to you, Aubrey. I wouldn't give you up to Her Highness and her crew, even when they threatened to torture me. Point of correction, Your Highness," he added. "Actually, I have no friends at all."
He slid forward on the ledge so he could peer over and look down on the way he'd come. Eventually they came into view, a crowd of pirates or warriors with purple-blue auras. At the head of the band, a tall woman in glittering armor, her silver hair snaking around her head, one hand clamped around Aubrey's arm. Her aura was blue-white, so brilliant that he had to squint against it. She was young, though, younger than he'd expected. Aubrey wasn't small, but she seemed very small in that company. She was dressed in the clothes she'd been wearing when he'd last seen her. So maybe she hadn't cashed in yet. When they reached the bottom of the steepest climb, the mage looked straight up at where Brion lay hidden, his mage mark rekindled like a flame against his skin. Now that she was closer, he could see that her silver hair had two broad streaks in it, one gold, the other blue.
"He's up there," the mage murmured to Aubrey. "Call him down."
"Brion!" Aubrey called, looking in his general direction and waving her hand. "Hey, Brion! It's Aubrey! Come down here! I've brought help!" Brion said nothing. Maybe the mage suspected he was up there, but he wasn't going to open his mouth and leave no doubt. "I was crazy worried when you was in prison," Aubrey said. "I couldn't figure out a way to get you out, and here you got out on your own. I can't wait to hear how you done it." Brion said nothing.
"I thought you said the boy was a friend of yours," the mage hissed.
"He is," Aubrey said. "You sure he's up there?"
"He's up there," the mage said flatly.
Pulling Aubrey closer, she murmured something in her ear, then pushed her toward the foot of the trail. "Bree," Aubrey said, looking paler than before. "You're probably wondering who my friends are. This is Celestine, and she's an actual Empress. She's from wherever it is you come from. She says she can fill you in on your family, all the things you don't know. Won't that be fine?" She extended her hands toward Brion, as if she might catch him if he jumped. Brion wrapped his arms around his knees. As he did so, he felt something lumpy in his pocket. When he pulled it out, he saw that it was the flute Hal had given him. He weighed it in his hands. Down below, Celestine chose out 4 of her mage-ish pirates.
"I want you to go up and get him. Remember what I said. I don't want the boy harmed in any way. Anything happens to him, you'll regret the day you were born."
Her concern should have been reassuring, even heartwarming maybe, but it wasn't. She's like the weather on the Indio, Brion thought, fair to stormy in the blink of an eye. Now he heard the warriors toiling up the trail toward him. When he peered over the edge, he could see them. Already they were nearly halfway up, but they'd reached a difficult overhang. As he watched, one of them detached a grappling hook from his belt and side-armed it, aiming it just above the spot where Brion was hiding. It clanged against the rock, then caught and held, the rope dangling down out of sight. Moments later, the rope went taut. They were climbing. Right. Pirates carry grappling hooks, don't they? Just his luck. Reaching up behind him, he pried at it, but it was wedged in so tightly he couldn't move it. But there was another option.
"You're not a violent person," he told himself.
You're a lover, not a hater. Then again, you've always loved the flute. Brian reached up again, gripped the grappling hook, and listened for music. A grappling hook is usually not a beloved object, so it didn't come as clearly as he would have liked. Still, he caught a thread of it. Raising the flute to his lips, Brian began to play a lively tune, a jig of sorts. The warriors climbing toward him froze for a moment. Then the warrior in the lead, the owner of the grappling hook, began to smile. He straightened, stood upright, and began to dance, faster and faster. The warriors behind him backed up, trying to get out of the way, but he slammed into them. They fell, arms pinwheeling, hit the rocks once, twice, then landed on the sand. Their dancing colleague followed them off the edge. When he landed, he just lay there, his arms and legs twitching to the cadence of the tune. 3 were obviously dead. The 4th was seemingly alive, but broken. Down below, all of the warriors were moving, shuffling their feet a little. Even Aubrey, still wearing her panic-stricken expression. Only Celestine didn't join in. She just gazed up at Brian like he was a fat, juicy apple high on the tree that she couldn't reach. With the last warrior down, Brian stopped playing. Then, to his horror, the surviving warrior began dragging himself to the foot of the cliff. Despite his shattered limbs, he was still trying to reach him. Celestine pulled Aubrey closer and ran a line of flame down Aubrey's arm. Aubrey screamed and beat her arm against her side, but the flame didn't go out. Brian stopped playing and put his hands over his ears, trying to block the sound. But he couldn't. And he couldn't help remembering what it had been like when his own arm had been burned during the interrogation.
"Come down here, boy, or I'll burn your young friend to a cinder, bit by bit."
Celestine snarled.
"It will take a long time."
"You promised," Aubrey sobbed. "You promised you wouldn't hurt us."
"I promised that I would not hurt him,"
Celestine said, "but I never made any promises about you."
She looked up at Brian. "Since you seem to love dancing so much, let's see if your girl is any good at it." Now she directed flame at Aubrey's feet. Aubrey tried to run, but the flame found her, and she tried to stamp it out, but it just kept burning. So she plunged into the water, but it didn't seem to do any good. Brian could stand it no longer. Maybe Aubrey had betrayed him, but she didn't deserve this.
"Stop it!"
he cried, standing at the edge of the cliff, looking down at the mage.
"Stop hurting her!"
"He speaks," Celestine said with grim satisfaction. "If you want me to stop hurting her, then come down here."
"All right,"
he said, stuffing the flute back into his pocket.
"All right. Just give me a minute."
So Brian descended the way he'd come up, only much faster, slipping and sliding in his hurry, so that more than once he almost tumbled head over heels. Finally, he made it to the beach. Aubrey was writhing on the sand, half in and half out of the water. He hurried over to her, cradling her head, brushing the sand from her cheek. "I'm sorry, Bree," she said, breathless with pain. "I never meant to be a bad person, but it just happened." "Never mind," he said, trying to soothe her. He kept thinking about the fire in the dungeon at Chalk Cliffs and wondering if he could have been responsible. Finally, he looked up at Celestine.
"I'm here,"
he growled.
"That's what you wanted, isn't it? Now heal her."
Celestine shook her head, feigning regret. "I'm sorry, boy. There was a time I could have helped you. I no longer have that gift."
"Can't you at least do something about the pain?"
Brian's voice quivered. She shook her head. "Your girl betrayed you, boy. You don't owe her a thing." When Brian didn't respond, she extended a knife toward him, hilt first. "You can finish her if you like." Brion stood there, staring at the knife in the mage's hand through a red haze of fury and tears. As if in a dream, he heard a noise, a kind of snap. The air around Celestine shimmered and hardened. Something smacked into it, bounced off, and fell at his feet. It was an arrow. That broke Brion out of his reverie. He lunged forward, grabbed the hilt of the knife, and did his best to plunge it into the Empress's chest. But the knife slammed into the same barrier, and it flew from Brion's hand. Then 2 more of Celestine's warriors had him by the arms, dragging him back from her. 2 more thwacks, and Brion's captors staggered, staring down at the arrows sticking out of their chests. But they didn't loosen their grip any, even as their blood dripped onto the sand. Looking past Celestine, Brion could see Aubrey moving, dragging herself out of the water and across the sand toward the Empress. He could see that she had something in her fist, a sharp shell, maybe. But Celestine was focused elsewhere. "What do we have here?" she said, shading her eyes and staring in the direction the arrows had come from. "A hero?" "Leave them alone!" somebody shouted from the top of a nearby cliff. "Let them go!" "Or perhaps a heroine," Celestine amended. It was Her Highness. "Get out of here!" Brion shouted. "Go! Don't be stupid!" "Maybe she can't help herself, boy." Celestine laughed. "You are, after all, a charmer. Is this some kind of love triangle?" She turned to look at Aubrey, who was halfway between the water and her target. "You know," the Empress said, "I hate love triangles." Gripping her amulet and raising her hand, she immersed Aubrey in flame. Brion tried to rip free from his captors, but they held him fast, even though they should have been dead on the ground. Aubrey came to her feet, staggered forward 1 step, 2. She stumbled back as Her Highness's next arrow found its mark, and then Aubrey went down, still burning, but now beyond Celestine's reach. Brion heard 3 more thwacks in quick succession. Another arrow clattered against Celestine's barrier. 2 more found their marks among her soldiers. "Bravo," Celestine said, as if delighted. "I could use more archers like you in my army. How would you like to join my blood-sworn guard?" "Get back in your boat and leave," Her Highness said, her voice shaking with rage. "I have every intention of doing that," Celestine said, "but not without the boy. I've gone to a tremendous amount of trouble to find him. But no worries. You can come with us." With that, she sent a bolt of flames smashing into the cliff just under the princess's position. Stone shattered, and the cliff came down, ending in a pile of rubble at the bottom. Brion looked from the spot on the cliff where the princess had been to the rockfall at the bottom. He saw nothing moving. It seemed impossible that anyone could have survived that. "It's so much easier," Celestine said to nobody in particular, "when you don't have to take them alive." She nodded to the pirates pinioning Brion's arms. "Let's get the boy aboard before any more heroes show up." 47. The water is wide. Halston Madelon half scrambled, half fell the last 20 feet from the cliff to the beach. Even as he rolled to his feet, he knew he was too late. But that didn't stop him from charging across the sand to the water's edge and splashing a few yards into the waves. It was no use. 200 yards of gunmetal water separated Hal from the jolly boat, a gulf that grew as the oarsmen strained and pulled. The boat was already halfway to the ship that waited at the mouth of the inlet. Hal resisted the urge to shake his fist at the fleeing pirates. Talbot skidded to a stop beside him, spitting out a series of oaths. Shading her eyes, she glared after the boat, which by now was pulling alongside the bigger ship. "Is that them? Do you think they're aboard?" Hal shook his head. "I don't know. I'm guessing they're either aboard
or dead. So maybe we should hope for the former. Is there any chance they'll be intercepted by your navy before they leave the shore waters?"
Hope kindled momentarily in Talbot's eyes, then was as quickly extinguished.
"I'd say it was unlikely. We just don't have that many ships, especially this far north of Chalk Cliffs. We have to focus on keeping our eastern ports open and protecting our roads and cities."
She released a shaky breath.
"This is my fault. It was my idea to escape by boat. Lissa's scared to death of the water. I should have listened to her."
Hal was only half listening. He wished he had Lissa's glass so he could get a better look. It looked like they were lifting somebody from the jolly boat up onto the deck. Somebody who was either dead or unconscious. They winched the boat aboard, too, and hastily raised anchor. They ran the sails up the masts. At first the sails flapped, spilling air, but as the ship turned, they inflated, and she put on speed. There was nothing remotely magical about Hal, but instinct told him a Lissa gray wolf was aboard that ship and quickly moving out of reach. Hal couldn't watch any more, so he turned back toward the beach. Bodies littered the sand, all bristling with arrows. From the way they were dressed, Hal guessed they'd come off the ship. Talbot pulled one of the arrows free and examined it.
"Liz got some shots in anyway. These arrows are clan-made, and I know it wasn't the busker."
She looked up and down the beach.
"I count 5 down."
"6, Hal said. A charred body lay on the sand at the water's edge, with an arrow centering its chest. Though most of the body had been consumed, it was still smoldering. Hal squatted next to it, pressing his sleeve over his nose against the stink of burning flesh. From the remains of the clothing, he guessed it was a girl, someone dressed differently from the other bodies on the beach, but not in Highlander spatter cloth.
"Unless I'm mistaken, this one was done by Majory," he said, sitting back on his heels. "I've seen bodies burned like this on the battlefield."
"That doesn't make sense," Talbot muttered.
"Pirates using Majory?"
Hal crossed the sand to where several house-sized chunks of rock littered the bottom of the cliff. He could see that it was a new fall. The edges were raw, unvarnished by wind and rain. Head-sized chunks were scattered all the way to the water's edge. Next to the base of the cliff, he saw 2 bodies, half buried in the debris. Again, warriors from the ship, maybe killed in the fall.
"Careful," Talbot called. "It might be unstable. It looks like there was an explosion or something, or more Majory."
Methodically, he began to root through the rubble, guarding his heart against what he might find. Up against the cliff face, in a spot where 2 huge boulders stood propped against each other, the sand was spotted with blood. Not a lot of blood, but something glittered from a crevice, nearly at eye level. Hal pulled the object out. It was a pendant, a gold locket, in fact, engraved with a rose. He turned to find Talbot right behind him.
"Do you recognize this?" he asked her.
Talbot licked her cracked lips and nodded.
"It belongs to Liz." "Was she wearing it?"
Talbot nodded.
"I've never seen her without it, except for when— Yes, she was wearing it."
Hal looked up the cliff, then out to where the bodies littered the beach. He swore softly.
What is it?"
Talbot snapped.
"I'm thinking Captain Gray was shooting from up here somewhere, and there was an explosion, or a bolt of magic, and she fell."
With that, Talbot began digging through the rubble like a madwoman until her hands were battered and bleeding. Soon she was leaving her own blood smeared on the rocks. Hal joined in. Side by side, they rolled rocks away. There wasn't all that much rubble on the beach, and it soon became clear to Hal that Lys's body wasn't buried under it. Relief flooded through him.
"Talbot,"
he said gently. Talbot looked up from her digging, her face tear-streaked.
"What?" "She's not here."
He paused, and when she just glared at him, he added,
Do you want to hear my theory?
Grudgingly, she nodded.
I think Grey was injured in the fall, he said, but she was conscious, because she tucked her locket in the niche in the rocks for us to find. She knew that you would know it was hers, and that it meant that she was alive.
From the look on Talbot's face, she liked his theory very much.
Now, let's see what else we can find, he said.
They divided up the beach and walked it methodically.
What I don't get